Section 1. The surface things you noticed but never questioned. Let's start somewhere comfortable. Picture the couch. The orange couch in the living room of 742 Evergreen Terrace. Homer comes thundering in from the left. Marge glides in gracefully. Bart skateboards through the door. Lisa cartwheels. And Maggie appears last in Marge's arms. They all hit the cushions at once and stare at the television. And for 35 years, that's where we've been sitting right alongside them, watching, laughing, occasionally crying, and mostly not asking questions. But here's what happens when you start asking questions. The whole show opens up like a wound, not in a painful way, more like the way you find a hidden door in a house you thought you knew perfectly. Behind that door is another hallway, and behind that hallway is a staircase going down. That's what this is. A staircase going down. We're going to start at the very top, where the light is still good and everything seems almost normal. These are the things that are right there on the surface of The Simpsons, visible in every single episode, mentioned occasionally but never fully explained. The details that you absorbed without realizing it, that lodged themselves somewhere in the back of your brain and just quietly lived there. The yellow skin comes first because it always does. The yellow skin? Every character in Springfield, with a handful of carefully chosen exceptions, is drawn yellow. Not a natural skin tone. Not peachy, not tan, not olive. Bright, saturated Crayola crayon yellow. The kind of yellow you'd use to draw the sun in second grade. The official explanation, the one the creators have given in interviews, is that Klasky Supo animator Georgi Palus chose yellow specifically because it would jump off the screen when a viewer was channel surfing. This was 1989. There were 4 broadcast networks. If you were flipping channels and caught even a half-second glimpse of a yellow person, you'd stop. The color was a marketing decision disguised as an aesthetic one. And it worked. The yellow became iconic so fast that within a few years it stopped seeming strange at all. Your brain filed it under cartoon logic and moved on. But cartoon logic is worth examining, because The Simpsons doesn't actually operate on standard cartoon logic. When a character has a heart attack, they die or come terrifyingly close. When a family loses their house, they feel genuine terror. When a marriage nearly falls apart, there's real grief in the room. This is a show that reached for emotional realism in ways that most live-action dramas of the same era didn't dare attempt. So why yellow? One fan theory, one that's been floating around long enough that it's become semi-canonical in the community, is that the yellow skin isn't a stylistic choice at all. It's a radiation marker. Everyone in Springfield lives within proximity of the Springfield nuclear power plant, which we'll come back to in extraordinary detail later. The plant has, by multiple on-screen counts, hundreds of active safety violations. The town's water comes from a source that has been shown to glow. The soil around Springfield Elementary contains levels of something that turn the grass a slightly wrong shade of green. If you live your whole life next to a leaking nuclear facility, what does that do to your skin over generations? Yellow, maybe? We'll hold that thought until Section 10. The 4 fingers. Every character in The Simpsons has 4 fingers. 4. 1 thumb and 3 other fingers. If you've never consciously registered this, look the next time you watch. It's genuinely startling once you see it, because the hands are drawn large enough that you really notice the absence. The practical reason is elegant. Drawing 4 fingers instead of 5 saves animators time. In a weekly animated series being produced at the pace The Simpsons was produced in the early 1990s, that's not a trivial savings. Multiply 1 finger across every character, in every scene, in every episode, across a 35-year run, and you've saved an incalculable amount of time and money. But The Simpsons acknowledge this choice in the show itself, which is where it gets interesting. In one of the show's more self-aware moments, God appears, and God has 5 fingers. God is drawn with a full human hand. This was deliberate. The writers were essentially encoding a rule into the visual grammar of the show. Everyone in Springfield is slightly less than human, and the divine exists outside that limitation. What's stranger is what this implies about the world of Springfield itself. If everyone has 4 fingers, then their entire material culture is built around 4 fingers. Their piano keyboards, their gloves, their handshakes, their gestures, all of it assumes 4. It's a complete, internally consistent civilization that simply happens to have 1 fewer finger per hand than ours. The show never dwells on this. It doesn't need to. It just quietly builds an entire world with slightly wrong hands and never asks you to notice. Blinky the Three-Eyed Fish. In Season 2, a fish is caught in the river near the nuclear power plant. The fish has 3 eyes, a third one growing from its forehead. His name, given by Bart, is Blinky. And Blinky becomes the center of a political storyline in which Mr. Burns runs for governor and nearly loses because of the mutant fish. Blinky is played for laughs. The episode is sharp political satire, and Blinky is the punchline. But here's the thing about Blinky. He doesn't go away. In subsequent episodes, in background shots, in crowd scenes at the river, three-eyed fish appear regularly. They're not remarked upon. They're just there, swimming in the background, part of the environment. This is a river that produces three-eyed fish as a matter of course. The people of Springfield fish from this river. They eat from this river. In one episode, Mr. Burns is served Blinky at a state dinner and eats him without hesitation. The environmental horror of that is real, and the show knows it's real, and presents it anyway with complete deadpan commitment. Springfield is a town that has accepted three-eyed fish as local fauna. Nobody in the EPA is coming. Nobody in state government is investigating. Burns ran for governor on this and nearly won. Blinky is a tiny, quiet apocalypse living in the background of every outdoor Springfield scene. Springfield's impossible geography. Where is Springfield? This question has been asked by fans, journalists, academics, and the show's own creators for decades. And the answer delivered officially by Matt Groening in 2012 is that Springfield is in Oregon. He named his childhood home state. But the show itself has, over 35 years, contradicted this answer so many times and so thoroughly that Oregon functions more as a starting point than a conclusion. Springfield has mountains. Springfield has a coastline. Springfield has a desert that Bart and Lisa ride into on horseback. Springfield has a glacier. Springfield has a rainforest. Springfield has a canyon. Springfield has a metropolitan area large enough to host major sports franchises and international events, and a rural area remote enough to conceal entire militias and survivalist compounds. No single American state contains all of these. Oregon comes closest, maybe, but that's not really the point. The writers made a conscious decision early in the show's run to never canonically confirm Springfield's location, and they've enforced that decision with a kind of gleeful aggression. When characters reference neighboring states, the states change. When characters drive, the geography changes. When Bart calls Moe's Tavern from what appears to be a different state, the show shrugs and moves on. The effect of this is subtle but cumulative. Springfield stops feeling like it's located somewhere and starts feeling like it could be located anywhere. Every American viewer can look at Springfield and see their town. The grim power plant on the edge of the city, the elementary school with the leaking roof, the bar where the same people have sat for 30 years, the church across from the bar, the nuclear family in the house with the orange couch. Springfield isn't in Oregon. Springfield is in all of us, which sounds sentimental until you start thinking about what Springfield actually is, and then it sounds like a mild threat. The floating timeline. Here is the most structurally peculiar thing about The Simpsons, and it's right there in the open, visible in every single episode, and most people have simply chosen not to think about it too hard. The show began in 1989. In 1989, Homer was approximately 35 years old. Bart was 10, Lisa was 8. Maggie was 1. The year is now 2026. The show is still being made. Homer is still 35. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still 1. This is called a floating timeline, and it's a deliberate structural choice. The characters are permanently frozen in amber while the world moves around them. The show's universe updates. The technology updates. The cultural references update. The jokes reference current events. But the characters never age, never grow, never change in any fundamental way. In early episodes, Bart's birth is placed in the 1980s. In later episodes, his birth is repositioned to the 1990s, then the 2000s. Homer's backstory shifts to accommodate whatever year the joke requires. The family has visited the future multiple times in Bart to the Future, in Lisa's Wedding, in the Treehouse of Horror segments, and each time the future is slightly different, slightly recalibrated. The writers and showrunners have talked about this openly. They describe it as a necessary creative freedom. If Bart aged in real time, he'd be in his late 40s by now, and the show would be something completely different. By keeping him 10 forever, they can keep telling Bart stories. But here's where the floating timeline stops being just a production choice and starts being something philosophically strange. In the episode That 90s Sesh Show, Season 19, Episode 11, the show actually rewrote Homer and Marge's origin story to fit the 1990s, contradicting multiple established canonical flashbacks from earlier seasons that place their early relationship firmly in the 1970s and 1980s. The fandom reacted with genuine outrage, and the episode is widely considered non-canonical, meaning fans chose to reject it and the show more or less allowed them to. This matters because it reveals something about the contract between The Simpsons and its audience. The audience is expected to hold two contradictory things in mind at once. The characters are real enough to care about, but the timeline is flexible enough to be rewritten when necessary. You're asked to be emotionally invested in people who technically do not age, do not die, do not remember last week's lesson this week, and whose personal histories can be revised at the showrunner's discretion. And somehow, 35 years in, that contract still holds. The show has trained us to love people who exist outside of time. That's a remarkable thing to have accomplished. Whether it's comforting or unsettling probably depends on what time it is when you're watching and what you're thinking about when the couch gag ends. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell us where you are in the world and what time it is where you're sitting. There's something wonderful about imagining all the different places this reaches, and if you want more like this, subscribe. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss what's coming. Section 2. Background Character Mysteries. The People Springfield Forgot to Explain. Springfield is a crowded town. Beyond the Simpsons themselves, beyond the handful of characters who get names and storylines and episode arcs, there's an entire population living in the margins. The background. The crowd scenes. The bar stools and church pews and bleacher seats that need to be filled with somebody. Most of those somebodies are just visual filler bodies placed to suggest a world existing beyond the frame. But a few of them are something else entirely. A few of them have accumulated enough screen time, enough lines, enough quietly strange details that they've become mysteries in their own right. Characters the show gave just enough rope to be fascinating, and then left dangling. Let's start with the one whose existence is perhaps the most mathematically troubling. Hans Moleman, the oldest man who ever died. Hans Moleman is the small, deeply unfortunate man who shuffles through Springfield, wearing thick glasses and an expression of resigned suffering. He first appeared in Season 2. His name, when it was finally given, turned out to be Hans Moleman, though he was once registered under the name Ralph Mellish, which was either a throwaway gag or a clue the show never chose to develop. He is 31 years old. This is established in canon. Hans Moleman, the wrinkled, nearly blind, deeply hunched man who looks approximately 80, gave his age as 31 in a courtroom while explaining that alcohol had done this to him. Drinking has aged him prematurely. He is a 31-year-old man living inside the body of a very old one. This is played as a quick joke, the kind the show excels at one line, land the laugh, move on. But 31-year-old Hans Moleman then goes on to appear in dozens of subsequent episodes, always the same, always ancient-seeming, always suffering. And here's where Hans Moleman becomes genuinely strange. He dies. Repeatedly. He is crushed by a boulder. He is set on fire. He is buried alive. He appears to drown. He is run over. He is launched into space. In one Treehouse of Horror segment, he is explicitly killed, and in the next scene he is back, intact, shuffling along. Hans Moleman exists in a state of perpetual near-death that the show never acknowledges. He is the town's designated victim, the universe's chosen target, the figure who absorbs misfortune so that others don't have to. And he keeps surviving, or keeps returning. The show never clarifies which. The fan community has developed a theory about Hans Moleman that has more adherents than you might expect. That he is not a man at all, but a kind of town spirit, a genius loci. Springfield's suffering made ambulatory. Every town has one that figure who absorbs the bad luck, who exists at the intersection of comedy and tragedy, who you feel slightly guilty laughing at because the jokes about him involve genuine pain. Springfield's version shuffles around in glasses too thick to see through, gets set on fire with some regularity, and is apparently 31 years old. He is never explained. He doesn't need to be. The mystery of Hans Moleman is partly that he's been handed so many opportunities to become real, to get backstory, to get resolution, and the show has consistently refused to cash them in. He remains suspended in perpetual looping misfortune, and that suspension is the joke and the tragedy simultaneously. Sideshow Bob and the system that keeps releasing him. Sideshow Bob is Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., and he is one of the great villains in animated television history. A classically trained performer who worked as Krusty the Clown's silent sidekick, he framed Krusty for armed robbery, was sent to prison, got out, immediately attempted to murder Bart Simpson, got sent back to prison, got out again, immediately began another murder attempt, and so on, across 14 major appearances spanning 3 decades. The question that the show cheerfully refuses to answer is, why does the legal system of Springfield keep releasing him? Sideshow Bob has attempted murder multiple times, on a child, with witnesses. He has escaped from prison. He has been convicted under multiple charges. He once nearly married Aunt Selma as part of an elaborate scheme. He moved to Italy and became mayor of a small village, and when the Simpsons tracked him down, he was almost immediately plotting again. The Springfield legal system is demonstrated, repeatedly, to be catastrophically broken. Judge Snyder is indifferent. The prosecutors are overwhelmed. Public defenders are practically non-existent, and parole boards well. In one episode, Sideshow Bob is shown addressing a parole board and delivering such a moving, eloquent speech that the board votes unanimously to release him, despite the documented history of attempted murder. The scene is funny. It's also a precise diagnosis of how charisma interacts with institutions designed to evaluate behavior rather than performance. Sideshow Bob gets out because he can talk his way out, because the system responds to presentation and eloquence rather than evidence of rehabilitation, because the same intelligence that makes him a brilliant villain makes him exceptional at performing the kind of person a parole board wants to release. The joke here has layers. The show is making a point about institutions, about the way intelligence and articulateness function as social currency even in contexts where they shouldn't. A less eloquent man with Sideshow, Bob's record would never be released. Bob performs contrition with the same theatrical commitment he once used to frame an innocent man, and the performance works every time. He never succeeds in killing Bart. This is structural. The show can't kill Bart, but the show has given Bob enough genuine menace, enough scenes of real danger, that the comedy never fully neutralizes the threat. Even in his funniest appearances, there's a low hum of genuine malevolence underneath. He once sang the entire score of HMS Pinafore to delay his own execution. This is presented as his finest hour and his deepest absurdity simultaneously. A man facing death by lethal injection, choosing to perform Gilbert and Sullivan because performance is what he is. The parole board would probably release him for that too. Krusty the Clown, the man behind the grease paint. Krusty Hyman Krustofsky is Bart Simpson's hero. The clown whose face is on Bart's bedsheets, whose show Bart never misses, whose merchandise fills Bart's room. Krusty is also a deeply cynical businessman, a gambling addict, a tax cheat, a multiple divorcee, and a man who visibly hates every moment of his job. He is also, in certain lights, Homer Simpson. This parallel was originally intended to be an explicit plot point. Early in the show's development, the idea was that Krusty would be revealed to be Homer in disguise, that Bart's idol and his father were the same person, and that Bart had spent years worshipping the man he spent those same years dismissing. The reveal would have been devastating and funny and deeply strange. The show dropped this idea before it made it to air. The writers decided it was too complicated to sustain, too difficult to explain logistically. Krusty became his own character, but the visual parallel was kept. Look at Krusty and Homer side by side. Same build, same face shape, same basic construction. In-universe jokes acknowledge this. Characters who meet both have occasionally mixed them up. There's an entire episode about Homer being mistaken for Krusty and nearly executed, which only works as a premise because the visual similarity is real enough for the confusion to be plausible. What remained of the original concept is the emotional parallel. Both Krusty and Homer are men who are bad at their jobs in some fundamental way, who are loved anyway, who are disappointed by themselves and by the gap between who they wanted to be and who they became. Homer's disappointments are domestic and blue-collar. Krusty's are show business and show business adjacent. Both of them have a child who deserves better and loves them fiercely anyway. The difference is that Bart knows exactly who Krusty is. Cynical, corrupt, indifferent to his audience's well-being, and loves him anyway. whereas Bart spends significant portions of the early show furious at Homer for being exactly the kind of man Krusty openly is. The shadow of the original concept gives the show's Krusty storylines an added layer. When Krusty reconnects with his estranged rabbi father, it's played as genuine emotion, and it lands with real weight because underneath it is the original idea that Krusty was supposed to be the relationship between Bart and his father, an acknowledgement and celebration. The sea captain, a man of inexplicable presence. His name is Captain Horatio McAllister. He is known universally as the sea captain. He speaks with an exaggerated nautical drawl and punctuates his sentences with nautical metaphors. He appears to operate a seafood restaurant called the Frying Dutchman. He also appears to be an actual working sea captain, though what he captains and where he goes between appearances is never established. He has a hook for a hand. The hook has never been explained. In one episode, in a throwaway line, he mentions that he lost his hand in some undescribed maritime incident. In another episode, his hand appears to be intact, which either means the hook is removable or means the continuity person was asleep. The show doesn't seem bothered either way. What makes the sea captain enduringly fascinating is how many scenes he appears in that have nothing to do with the sea or seafood. He's at the baseball game. He's in the bar. He's at the school meeting. He's in the crowd watching the house fire. He has strong opinions about things that have nothing to do with nautical life. He appears to live in Springfield full-time, running a restaurant that seems to open and close and change menus depending on what the joke requires, operating boats that are sometimes visible in the harbor and sometimes not, and existing in the background of Springfield life with the comfortable permanence of a man who has always been there and always will be. One theory probably not intended by the writers, but supported by the visual evidence, is that the sea captain represents Springfield's connection to a wider world that the show never bothers to depict. Springfield, despite its impossible geography, must be connected to somewhere. Goods come in, some people go out. The sea captain is the town's trade route made flesh the suggestion of a world beyond Springfield that the narrative never follows. He has a hook for a hand and he's at every single community event. That's Springfield for you. Dr. Nick Riviera and the medical infrastructure of Springfield. Hi, everybody. Dr. Nick Riviera graduated from a medical school in the Caribbean that the show implies was not fully accredited. He performs surgery with tools that are occasionally described as being found rather than purchased. His bedside manner is defined by aggressive cheerfulness and a lack of apparent concern for medical outcomes. Several of his patients have died on screen, and he appears undisturbed by this. He is the only doctor available to people in Springfield who cannot afford Dr. Hibbert. This is the real horror of Dr. Nick, and the show handles it with a lightness that makes the darkness easier to absorb. Springfield has two doctors in regular operation. Julius Hibbert, competent, warm, slightly expensive, who serves the families who can manage his fees, and Nick Riviera, cheerfully incompetent, criminally cheap, who serves everyone else. Homer goes to Dr. Nick, not because Homer is ignorant, not because Homer doesn't know the difference. Homer goes to Dr. Nick because Dr. Nick is what Homer can afford. The episodes where Homer nearly dies of weight-related heart problems, the episodes where Homer ingests something toxic and needs urgent care, the episodes where Bart has broken something. These are the episodes where Dr. Nick appears with his cheerful greeting and his improvised instruments. And the joke is always that Dr. Nick is terrible. But underneath the joke is a working-class family navigating a medical system that has sorted them toward the worst available option. Dr. Hibbert laughs warmly and knows exactly what he's doing. He serves the part of Springfield that can pay. Dr. Nick serves the part that can't. That's not a comedy premise. That's just how healthcare works for a lot of people, drawn in bright yellow and played for laughs, and it's somehow more honest than most television has ever been about the same subject. Barney Gumble, the saddest genius in Springfield. Barney Gumble is Homer's best friend, the bar's resident alcoholic, a man whose entire identity has been consumed by a single terrible habit. He is the show's tragedy presented as comedy, more consistently and more devastatingly than almost any other character. What most viewers eventually learn, through the accumulated detail of 35 years of episodes, is that Barney Gumble was once something different. He was a student with genuine academic potential. He was accepted to Harvard. He was, by every available evidence, intelligent, ambitious, capable of a life very different from the one he's living. Homer gave him his first beer. This is canon. This is a thing the show said put in an episode and left there without fanfare. Homer Simpson's gave Barney Gumble his first drink in high school. What happened after is the unspoken foundation of every scene where Barney is slumped on a bar stool. The Harvard acceptance letter exists somewhere in a drawer. The man who might have gone exists somewhere in the past. The show gave Barney a sobriety arc in season 11. He got sober. He was clear-eyed, articulate, genuinely funny in a different way than drunk Barney was funny. He filmed a short film about his sobriety that was so moving it won a film festival, and then Barney relapsed at his own film's victory celebration, because of course he did. Because the show could only sustain sobriety Barney for so long before it needed its reliable comedic architecture back. What the sobriety arc demonstrated was that the writers knew exactly who Barney was underneath. They'd thought about it. They'd built a version of him who got out, and then they walked it back, because Springfield doesn't really let people get out. Barney remains at the bar stool, Harvard remains in the drawer, and every joke about his drinking lands on top of a pile of what might have been. Section 3. The Simpson family's buried secrets. What the house on Evergreen Terrace is hiding. There's a version of The Simpsons that is exactly what it presents itself as. A working-class family stumbling through ordinary American life with good hearts and bad luck. That version is warm, funny, occasionally profound. But there's another version sitting directly underneath the first one, where you look at each member of this family and realize that the show has been quietly, carefully, embedding something much darker into every one of them. Let's go room by room. Homer, the crayon in his brain. In Season 12, Episode 9, Homer discovers the reason he's not very smart. When Homer was a young child, he shoved a crayon up his nose. The crayon traveled deep into his nasal cavity and lodged in his frontal lobe. The lodged crayon has been there ever since, physically impairing his cognitive function, artificially keeping his IQ at the level it's been at throughout the series. This episode then removes the crayon, and the show does something remarkable with what happens next. Without the crayon, Homer's IQ rises significantly. He becomes intelligent, not in a superhero way, not in a genius way, just genuinely, normally intelligent. And the episode spends significant time exploring what that version of Homer experiences. He can follow complex conversations. He can engage with the ideas Lisa has been desperate to discuss with someone. He can appreciate things he never could before. The episode is funny. It's also quietly devastating, because what it reveals is this. For 35 years, we have been watching a man whose potential was accidentally destroyed in childhood and who has been living, unknowingly, with that loss ever since. The Homer we know bumbling, impulsive, unable to learn from experience is not Homer. Homer is something that existed before the crayon, and something that exists briefly during the episode's middle act. But the episode ends with Homer choosing to reinsert the crayon, and this is the part that matters. Homer removes the crayon, becomes smarter, and then, after sitting with it, decides he would rather be the Homer everyone knows. Because the smarter Homer is lonely. Because intelligence in Springfield puts you at a distance from the people around you, as Lisa has demonstrated for 35 years. Because the Homer people love is the Homer with the crayon in his brain, and Homer would rather be loved than smart. He chooses the crayon. There is something both incredibly tender and genuinely heartbreaking about that choice. The show lets Homer make it without judging him. It just presents the decision and its consequences and moves on to the next episode, where Homer has forgotten everything again and the crayon is presumably back where it always was. The crayon is also a metaphor that the writers clearly knew they were deploying. Working-class men in America are expected to be a certain kind of not very smart. Not because they are intrinsically less intelligent, the episode argues explicitly that Homer isn't, but because intelligence without access to the right institutions and the right social scaffolding is isolating rather than liberating. The smart Homer doesn't know what to do with what he is. The crayon Homer fits. Marge, the blue hair and what it costs. Marge's hair is blue, tall, blue, improbably structural. It defies both gravity and reason. And the show has always treated it as simply what Marge's hair looks like. The origin of the color has occasionally been gestured at. In one flashback, her hair is a natural dark brown as a young woman, and the blue seems to have emerged over time. The most interesting theory about Marge's hair isn't about radiation, though radiation will come up in Section 10. The most interesting theory is anxiety. Marge is the emotional infrastructure of the Simpson family. She manages Homer's moods, mediates between the children, maintains the house, worries about everything, and presents a composed exterior to the neighborhood with considerable effort. She is, in the show's own terms, a woman carrying an enormous, invisible load that is never fully acknowledged by the people she carries it for. The show has given Marge explicit anxiety storylines. In Fear of Flying, she is revealed to have a severe flying phobia rooted in a childhood trauma she's never processed. In Marge on the Lam, she articulates a life of suppressed desires that she's been managing for years. In Marge versus the Monorail, her instinct to be cautious and careful and to pump the brakes on her husband's enthusiasms is treated as a character trait, sometimes affectionately, sometimes as an obstacle. She has been to therapy. The therapy helped. The next episode, she needed therapy again. The blue hair, in fan readings, functions as a kind of externalized anxiety, the visible marker of an internal state that Marge keeps carefully controlled. In every scene where she's at her most stressed, her hair somehow seems taller, more electric, more structurally intense. Whether this is intentional animation or projection is impossible to know. What is clear is that Marge is written as a person of enormous suppressed depth, someone who chose domesticity and made that choice real and serious, but who carries the weight of it in ways the show only occasionally acknowledges. She is a better person than Homer in almost every measurable way, and the show knows this and uses it both for comedy and for something more genuine. She married a man with a crayon in his brain. She stayed. The blue hair is at least partly the cost of that. Bart, the undiagnosed profile. Bart Simpson is the kid your teachers warned you about. The troublemaker, the underachiever, the smartass in the back row who is failing every class and seems proud of it. He is also, by every behavioral and cognitive measure the show depicts, a child who has never been correctly assessed. Bart is hyperactive. Bart is impulsive in ways that create immediate physical danger to himself and others. Bart has genuine difficulty with traditional academic tasks, but demonstrates exceptional creative intelligence, remarkable physical skill, and a social sophistication that adults consistently underestimate. He can read people with unusual accuracy. He can construct elaborate schemes. He can talk his way into and out of situations that would defeat someone of supposedly higher academic standing. In one episode, Bart is assessed by a school psychologist and diagnosed with ADHD, leading to a medication plotline that the show handles with unusual nuance, neither fully endorsing nor fully rejecting the medication, acknowledging that the same traits that create problems in a classroom context are genuine strengths in other contexts. But the diagnosis doesn't stick. The next episode, Bart is back at the default setting, unmedicated, unsupported, failing school, getting into trouble. Springfield Elementary is not equipped to serve Bart Simpson. It's barely equipped to serve anyone. The tragedy of Bart's academic situation is that the school's solution is always punitive. Lines on the chalkboard, detention, Principal Skinner's office. These are the tools of an institution that interprets Bart's behavior as willful defiance, rather than as a symptom of a child who has never been taught in a way that works for him. Mrs. Krabappel knows Bart isn't stupid. There are scattered episodes where this is made explicit, where she sees through the performance to the kid underneath, and where the show allows Bart a genuine moment of intellectual engagement that surprises both of them. These episodes are always touching and always forgotten by the next week. Bart is a kid who fell through the cracks of an underfunded, punitive school system, and the show depicted that with remarkable specificity without ever making it the show's explicit subject. It was just what happened to kids like Bart. It was ordinary, which might be the cruelest thing about it. Lisa, the loneliness of being ahead. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old, and she is the most isolated person in Springfield. Not because she's disliked, not because she's antisocial, but because she is, intellectually and emotionally, running at a frequency that no one around her can quite match, and she has been aware of this gap since she was old enough to understand what a gap was. She plays saxophone at a professional level and practices alone in her room. She reads at a university level, and there is no one to discuss what she reads with. She has ethical commitments, vegetarianism, environmentalism, a sense of social justice that put her at odds with her family, her town, and her culture. She is right about almost everything. The town ignores her or reacts with hostility when she points this out. The episodes where Lisa finds her people, the other gifted children, the visiting jazz musician, the young activist are among the most emotionally resonant in the series. They're so resonant because the show has spent so much time documenting her loneliness that any moment of genuine connection lands with disproportionate force. She has a recurring nightmare about being left behind when the family forgets her. She has had it more than once. The show plays it for laughs, but the specific content of the nightmare that her own family would leave without noticing she was gone is exactly the kind of fear that a child who feels fundamentally unwitnessed would have. Lisa will spend the rest of her life in Springfield, by the structural logic of the floating timeline, perpetually 8 years old, perpetually ahead of everyone around her, perpetually waiting for the world to become something she can fully participate in. The show has never found a satisfying resolution to Lisa's isolation. This is probably intentional. It's probably true. Maggie, the one who sees everything. Maggie Simpson doesn't speak. She's a baby. Babies don't speak. Except that Maggie is 1 year old across 35 years of a television show, and the show has had ample opportunity to explore what Maggie knows and feels and thinks, and it has done so in ways that suggest Maggie might be the most perceptive member of the entire family. She shot Mr. Burns. This is canon, confirmed at the end of Season 6 after an entire season of mystery. A baby shot one of the most powerful men in America and was not prosecuted because nobody takes a baby seriously as a suspect. She rescued Homer from a mafia kidnapping by picking a lock. She has been shown, in multiple Treehouse of Horror futures and in Lisa's wedding, to grow up into someone formidable, a confident, capable adult who carries the family's best qualities without its worst ones. But in the show's regular continuity, she is silent. She communicates through action. She absorbs everything. She is present in every family scene, watching the adults interact, processing information at a rate nobody credits her with. There's a theory that Maggie's silence is not a developmental stage, but a choice. That at some point, Maggie assessed her environment and concluded that speech was not in her best interest, that the adults around her were not going to respond to whatever she said in a way that served her, and that observation and action were more powerful tools than language. She watches Homer with adoration that is the purest love in the show. She also watches everything else. The family's arguments, the town's disasters, the adult world's hypocrisies. Maggie takes all of it in behind enormous eyes and says nothing. One day, presumably, she's going to have things to say. The family as system. Taken together, the Simpsons are not just a family, they're a carefully constructed machine for demonstrating what happens when a working-class American family tries to hold together under structural pressure. Homer's impairment explains why he can't get ahead. Marge's anxiety explains why she stays and tries to manage what can't be managed. Bart's undiagnosed profile explains why he's failing a system that was never designed for him. Lisa's intelligence explains why she's isolated in a world that rewards a narrower kind of competence. Maggie's silence explains why the most perceptive member of the family is the one nobody listens to. The show built this over decades, layer by layer, without ever announcing that it was doing it. You watch 30 episodes and you see a comedy. You watch 300 and you see a portrait. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace is a completely ordinary American house. That's the point. That's always been the point. The Treehouse of Horror as confession. What the Halloween episodes actually are. Every October, The Simpsons steps outside its own rules. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, which began in Season 2 and have aired annually ever since, operate under a stated agreement with the audience. The events depicted in these specials are not canonical. Characters die and return. Physical laws dissolve entirely. The tonal register shifts from satire into something closer to actual horror, or parody of horror, or a combination of both, that the show has refined across 30-plus annual installments into something genuinely strange and occasionally genuinely unsettling. Most viewers receive this framing as permission to enjoy the specials without worrying about continuity. The Halloween episodes don't count. Everyone dies, nobody stays dead. The reset is complete by the following week. Enjoy the darkness, because the darkness is contained. But the framing is worth examining more carefully, because the Treehouse of Horror episodes don't just explore darkness for its own sake. They explore specific darknesses. And the specific things that the show chooses to explore in its formally designated safe space, the things it says when the rules are suspended and the consequences are removed, follow patterns that are worth noticing. The first Treehouse of Horror contained 3 segments. One was a haunted house story. One was a close adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, with Homer as the anguished narrator and the Raven voiced by James Earl Jones. And one was an alien abduction story in which Homer and Bart are taken aboard a spacecraft, and the experience is depicted with a combination of cosmic horror and mundane inconvenience that perfectly captures the show's tonal signature. What the show chose to do in its first Halloween episode, its first formal excursion beyond its own rules, was put Homer at the center of all 3 stories. Homer in the haunted house, Homer reading Poe, Homer abducted. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are always at their core about what it would take to break Homer. They test him with monsters and aliens and parallel dimensions and death itself, in a space where the test can be made unlimited because the stakes are declared in advance to be fictional. And across 30 years of these tests, the show has found the same answer every time. Homer cannot be broken by anything the horror genre can generate. Not death, not damnation, not transformation, not cosmic insignificance. He absorbs all of it and returns to the couch. This is the same thing the regular episodes say, in a different register. Homer survives everything. Homer returns to normal. The reset is always complete. But the Halloween episodes say it louder and with more explicit violence, and in doing so they function as a kind of annual proof of the show's central emotional claim, that the love Homer has for his family is not just a domestic virtue, but something approaching a physical law. It cannot be undone by any force the show is willing to imagine. The horror episodes are the show testing its own thesis and finding it holds. The specific fears the show returns to. Look across the Treehouse of Horror episodes with an eye not for the horror genres being parodied, but for the specific anxieties the show keeps returning to, regardless of the genre. Homer's intelligence, or lack of it, appears repeatedly in Halloween contexts. There is an entire segment built around the premise that Homer's brain is so minimal that the alien intelligence trying to operate it from the inside is barely able to function. There is another segment in which Homer's stupidity is literally the thing that defeats a powerful supernatural force, because the supernatural force cannot successfully predict behavior that has no underlying logic. The Halloween episodes use the horror frame to make explicit something the regular episodes imply. Homer's cognitive limitations are not just a character trait. They are the specific condition through which Homer interacts with every challenge, and they are simultaneously a disability and, in certain contexts, a form of protection. A man who cannot understand the threat is a man the threat cannot fully reach. Homer's fog is genuinely impenetrable to any intelligence attempting to operate according to normal cause and effect reasoning. The aliens trying to read his mind find it incomprehensible, not because Homer is hiding anything, but because there is no organizing logic there to decode. This is played for comedy. It is also the horror episode version of what the radiation theory describes. A man whose cognitive function has been so reduced by his environment that the reduction itself becomes a kind of immunity. He cannot be manipulated by a system he cannot understand. He cannot be frightened by a future he cannot imagine. He cannot be broken by a logic he cannot follow. Burns appears in the Halloween episodes more than almost any other secondary character, and his appearances tend toward the cosmic. He is Dracula. Explicitly, in one of the most memorable Halloween segments, a reading of Burns as immortal bloodfeeder that maps his relationship with Springfield's population in terms that the regular episodes dress up in economic language. The Halloween episode strips the dressing away. Burns lives by extracting life from the community around him. He is ancient beyond normal reckoning, and his survival depends on the continued vulnerability of the people he has arranged around himself. The haunted house, in the Simpsons Halloween universe, is always Springfield. The monster is always Burns, or whatever Burns represents in that season's specific horror genre. The family survives because families survive things. And the show tells you this again, in October, every year, in the specific language of horror that says what the regular episodes can only approach obliquely. The segment that went too far. In the Season 6 Treehouse of Horror, A segment called Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace depicts groundskeeper Willie as a Freddy Krueger figure, a figure who can enter children's dreams and harm them there. The segment is a parody, and it plays as comedy, as these things do. But the specific choice of Willie as the nightmare figure is interesting and slightly strange. Willie is not one of the show's characters who carries any particular darkness in his regular canon. He is gruff, he is Scottish. He tends to be the butt of jokes about his working conditions and his social isolation, but he is not sinister. He does not represent power or authority or the systems that harm the show's central family. He is, if anything, one of the more sympathetic members of Springfield's working class, a man who does difficult physical labor for inadequate compensation in an institution that has been systematically underfunded by the richest man in town. Making Willie the nightmare figure in a Freddy Krueger parody creates a strange resonance if you follow it. Freddy Krueger, in his source material, is a figure of harm done to children who is shielded from accountability by the community of adults who know what he did and choose not to acknowledge it. The horror of Nightmare on Elm Street is not just the supernatural capacity to enter dreams. It is the community's complicity. The parents who burned Freddy before the law could handle him, the adults who kept the secret, the children left to face the consequences of an accountability failure that preceded their ability to understand what was happening. The show chose to place this specific horror archetype, the one built around adult complicity and child harm, inside the Springfield elementary context, with the school's groundskeeper as the figure. And then it played it for laughs. And then it ended, as these things do, and the credits rolled, and the next episode began with Willie back in his normal role, maintaining the grounds of the school that burns underfunded with the oil extraction that provided Willie's workplace context in the first place. The Halloween episodes are allowed to say things the regular episodes cannot. They say them, and then they take them back, and the show moves on. But the things they choose to say, the specific shapes of darkness they choose to inhabit even temporarily, are not random. They are the show's fears about itself made visible for one episode per year, in a frame that allows them to be acknowledged and then safely contained. Section 14. The supporting cast as mirror. Apu Nahasapima Petalon and the American Dream's Other Side. Apu Nahasapima Petalon owns and operates the Quick E-Mart, Springfield's convenience store, the one that is open at all hours, the one where Homer buys the things he needs at the time of night when nothing else is accessible. Apu has a doctorate in computer science from the Calculus Institute of Technology in Calcutta, where he graduated first in his class of 7 million students. He is fluent in multiple languages. He is capable of sophisticated intellectual engagement. He is, by every measure of formal education and demonstrated intelligence, more qualified for advanced professional work than almost anyone else in Springfield. He runs a convenience store. He runs it with devotion and care, working extraordinary hours, maintaining the store to standards that exceed what the job formally requires of him. He runs it because the path from his qualifications to the professional life those qualifications would support has not been available to him in the way it would be available to someone navigating the same system from a different starting position. He runs it because the dream that brought him to America, the specific version of the American dream that promises that ability and effort and qualification will produce corresponding opportunity, has delivered something narrower and harder than the promise implied. The show has engaged with Apu's character with varying degrees of sensitivity and self-awareness across its run, and the show's relationship with its own handling of Apu has been discussed publicly enough that the contours of that conversation are part of the character's public biography. But underneath the debate about representation, which is legitimate and ongoing, there is something about Apu's position in Springfield that the show has been honest about in its better moments. Apu is Springfield's most visible illustration of the gap between what someone is capable of and what their specific position in a specific community allows them to do with that capacity. His doctorate and his 7 million-strong graduating rank exist alongside his position behind the Quick E-Mart counter, and the gap between them is not explained by any failure on his part. The gap is explained by the structure of the community he moved into and the specific constraints that structure places on people arriving into it from particular directions. Springfield is full of people doing work that is significantly below what they are capable of. Homer is a safety inspector with an IQ described as 55, but that number reflects damage rather than ceiling, as the crayon removal proved. Marge manages a household with organizational and emotional capacity that would serve well in demanding professional contexts, but is directed entirely inward toward a family that consumes it without acknowledging it. Apu has a doctorate and sells squishies. The community's failure to match people to work they are capable of, and its success at keeping them in positions that serve the existing structure's needs, is one of the show's most consistent quiet observations about the American labor landscape. Chief Wiggum and the nature of authority. Chief Clancy Wiggum is the head of the Springfield Police Department. This fact has been true for the entire run of the show. He has remained in this position despite a record of professional performance that would, in any functionally accountable institution, have produced consequences for his continued employment long before the show reached its current season count. His incompetence is documented across hundreds of episodes. He fails to prevent crimes. He fails to solve crimes after they occur. He arrests the wrong people. He provides false testimony. He loses evidence. He falls asleep on duty. He misidentifies suspects. He accepts bribes. He uses department resources for personal purposes. He confuses his professional role with his personal convenience on a consistent basis across decades of practice. He is also, underneath the incompetence and the corruption, a father who loves his son Ralph with a genuineness that the show has depicted with surprising care. The Ralph-Wiggum relationship, the devoted parent and the child whose cognitive profile is unlike anything in the show's regular population, is one of the show's least examined and most moving long-term emotional threads. Wiggum loves Ralph unconditionally and completely, in the specific way that parents love children whose differences from the norm have taught them that their child's worth has nothing to do with performance. The show uses Wiggum's competence failure as comedy and uses his paternal love as emotional counterweight, and the combination produces a character who is both a portrait of institutional dysfunction and a quietly rendered meditation on what love looks like when it has to exist entirely separate from any kind of worldly achievement. But Wiggum's position in Springfield's power structure is worth examining beyond his role as comedy incompetent. He is the head of law enforcement in a community with documented organized crime activity, a corrupt mayor, a billionaire who operates a facility with hundreds of safety violations, and a population that has been continuously harmed by its environment without any meaningful legal response. Wiggum is the specific mechanism through which all of this continues without legal consequence. Not because he is evil, not because he is running a deliberate conspiracy, but because he is exactly incompetent enough and exactly connected enough and exactly comfortable enough with the existing arrangement that the machine runs smoothly through him. He was, as a young man, accidentally cured of his asthma by the antibiotic bomb that Mona Simpson's activist group deployed against Burns's biological weapons lab. The man whose incompetence protects Burns's enterprise from legal accountability was personally helped by the woman who tried to destroy part of that enterprise. The irony is the kind that the show plants quietly in backstory and leaves for the attentive viewer to find. Sideshow Bob's family, the Terwilligers as a unit. Sideshow Bob does not exist in isolation. The show has, across its later seasons, developed the Terwilliger family into one of its richest background structures, a family of highly educated, highly cultured, deeply dysfunctional people whose collective inability to achieve their evident potential is as comprehensive as it is darkly comic. Cecil Terwilliger, Bob's brother, harbored his own resentment for years, the resentment of the more competent sibling who was passed over for the opportunity that went to the flashier one. Cecil wanted to be Krusty's sidekick. Cecil prepared for it, auditioned for it, was objectively the better candidate. Bob got it by sheer force of personality, without the qualifications, and spent the role as a springboard to a criminal career while Cecil remained in the background, competent and invisible, and increasingly resentful. The Terwilliger parents, when they appear, are a portrait of the kind of intellectual pretension that produces children who are more comfortable with formal knowledge than with the messy human circumstances in which that knowledge must be applied. They quote literature. They deploy cultural references. They perform sophistication with the thoroughness of people for whom sophistication is a primary value, a protection against the accusation that they are not exceptional. And their children, shaped by this performance, became people for whom the gap between their own estimate of their worth and the world's willingness to recognize it became the central wound of their existence. Bob's villainy, the specific shape of his obsession, the elaborate criminal plans always slightly undone by his own tendency toward theatrical excess, the plans that would work if he could resist the impulse to announce them, is the family pathology in its most extreme form. He is a man of genuine intelligence and genuine talent who has decided that the world's failure to appreciate him appropriately justifies whatever he does in response. The sense of entitlement is the inheritance. The criminal career is what the inheritance produces when the world declines to provide the recognition the inheritance believes it is owed. Cecil's resentment is the same wound expressed differently, as bitterness and scheming rather than as murderous obsession, but rooted in the same fundamental conviction that he deserved more than he received and that someone else is responsible for the gap. The Terwilligers are, among other things, a very specific portrait of what class and education and cultural pretension produce when they cannot find expression in outcomes commensurate with their self-assessment. They are Springfield's most concentrated illustration of the difference between capability and opportunity, between what people are and what their circumstances allow them to do with what they are. Section 15. The show's relationship with time. Time as the true subject. Everything we have examined in this video, every theory and mystery and buried detail, is ultimately in conversation with the same subject, time. What happens to people over time? What time does to families? What the refusal to acknowledge time's passage reveals about the people doing the refusing. What it means to love something so much that you would stop time to keep it. The floating timeline is not just a production convenience. It is the show's primary subject, dressed as a technical arrangement. The Simpsons is a show about what it means to be a family in time, and its central formal choice, the one that makes everything else possible, is to remove time from the equation and then examine what its absence reveals. Without time, the consequences of actions cannot accumulate in ways that change the characters permanently. Without time, the children cannot grow up and leave. Without time, the marriage cannot evolve into something different from what it was at the beginning. Without time, the neighborhood cannot gentrify or decay. The power plant cannot be replaced by newer technology. Burns cannot die of old age or be imprisoned by a legal system that finally catches up with him. The absence of time is the show's permission structure for its own deepest anxieties. It allows the show to explore the themes of family and community and institutional power and environmental harm without ever having to commit to a resolution, because resolutions require time, and time has been suspended. The show can examine what is wrong with Springfield indefinitely, because Springfield will never reach the moment when wrong becomes permanent damage rather than weekly comedy. But the absence of time is also a loss. Every decision has to be reversible. Every development has to be retractable. The characters cannot grow because growth requires time, and time is the thing the show cannot allow. What the show gains in the ability to keep the family together forever, it loses in the ability to tell stories about what happens to families that stay together, how they change and deepen and become something different from what they were at the beginning. The show knows this. It has been saying it with increasing directness across its later seasons. Episodes that explicitly depict the characters aging, or that explicitly reference the show's own relationship with time, are the show acknowledging what its formal choice costs it, and also, occasionally, suggesting that the cost is worth it, that what is preserved by stopping time is more important than what is lost. The flash-forward episodes. The show has depicted its characters as adults on multiple occasions, always in contexts that are clearly marked as hypothetical, as possible futures rather than actual ones, as glimpses through windows that close before they can be fully entered. Lisa's wedding from season 6 is the most fully realized of these. The episode flashes forward approximately 15 years, showing Lisa as a 23-year-old woman engaged to a young British man. The future it depicts is detailed and emotionally specific. Lisa has become the kind of person the show has always been building toward, intellectually accomplished, emotionally complex, still searching for connection, and still finding it difficult to locate in a world that has made different accommodations with its own limitations than she has made with hers. Homer has aged, Marge has aged, Bart has taken a path that is specific to him and recognizable to anyone who has watched him for 6 seasons. The episode proves something important about the show's capabilities. The Simpsons can depict its characters as adults. It can imagine them older. It can tell stories about who they would become if time were allowed to do what time does. The emotional range of the flash forward, the specific texture of how Homer and Lisa relate to each other when she is an adult and he is older and the power differential has shifted, shows that the show knows exactly what it would look like for these characters to grow up. It has thought about it carefully. It can depict it with precision. And then the episode ends and Lisa is 8 again. The window closes. The possible future is returned to hypothetical status. The floating timeline reasserts itself, and everything continues as before. The show does not keep these futures because keeping them would require the show to become something other than what it is. An eternal present in which the family is always intact, and the children are always young, and the house on Evergreen Terrace is always the same house it was in 1989. The flash-forward episodes are the show acknowledging what it is choosing not to be every time it returns the characters to their fixed ages. They are small monuments to the paths not taken, kept visible enough to be seen but never developed enough to become binding. The episodes that hurt. There are episodes in the show's run that punch through the comedy framing in ways that the comedy framing cannot fully contain. Episodes that arrive at emotional territory that the show usually approaches obliquely, but in these cases enters directly, and the directness produces something that sits uncomfortably in the memory long after the jokes around it have faded. Mother Simpson is one. The episode in which Homer finds his mother, loses her again, and then stands on a hillside watching her taillights disappear into the dark is not primarily a comedy. The comedy is there, the show never abandons it entirely, but the emotional center of the episode is genuine grief, the specific grief of a man who spent 30 years believing he was unloved, and then discovered that the belief was a lie, and then lost the person who had disproved it before he could fully integrate what that loss and that recovery meant. To him. Homer stands on the hillside until her lights are gone, and then he stands there longer, and the episode does not cut away or let him quip or return to the familiar rhythms. It just lets him stand there in the dark for a moment. And then the credits roll, and next week Bart is pulling a prank, and Homer is falling down, and Springfield is exactly as it was. Selma's Choice. The episode where Homer and the family go to a theme park after Marge's great-aunt dies, and Selma, who has always wanted children, agrees to take the kids and discovers through the experience both how much she wants a child and how the specific circumstances of her life have made that want increasingly difficult to fulfill. The episode ends with Selma choosing to adopt a baby iguana rather than a human child, and the show plays this as a happy resolution, and Selma does seem happy with it. But there is something in the episode's treatment of what Selma wanted and what she settled for that the comedy cannot fully neutralize. These episodes are the ones the show's defenders point to when the show is accused of being nothing more than surreal comedy for its own sake. They demonstrate that the emotional infrastructure of the early seasons was always capable of real feeling, not just the simulation of feeling that parody and satire can produce. They demonstrate that the characters were always capable of genuine depth, that the comedic surface was always a choice rather than a limitation. They are also the episodes that make the floating timeline most painful, because these are the episodes where the stakes feel highest, where the losses feel most real, and the knowledge that next week everything will be reset without consequence is most difficult to accept as a satisfying arrangement. Section 16. The smaller mysteries that stay with you. Kang and Kodos. What they are actually saying. Kang and Kodos are the show's Halloween aliens, two gray creatures with tentacles and single enormous eyes who appear in the Treehouse of Horror specials with remarkable regularity. They observe Springfield from a position of cosmic detachment, commenting on human behavior with the mixture of contempt and bafflement that one might expect from beings of presumably superior intelligence, encountering a species whose primary defining characteristic is its capacity to make things worse for itself. They are comedy characters. They exist to deliver specific kinds of jokes. Jokes about alien abduction tropes. Jokes about the gap between human self-importance and human actual significance. Jokes about political process, which they have engaged with directly in at least one famous Halloween segment. They are well-defined, well-deployed, and serve the show's tonal needs in their designated context efficiently. But Kang and Kodos, examined from a certain angle, are something else as well. They are the only recurring characters in the show's universe who exist entirely outside Springfield's self-reinforcing system. They are not affected by the plant's radiation. They are not subject to Burns's influence. They are not participants in Springfield's collective agreement to maintain its comfortable fictions. They observe Springfield from the outside, with no stakes in its particular arrangements, and their commentary on what they observe, filtered through the comedy framing that the Halloween specials provide, is the show's closest approximation of an external view of its own subject matter. When Kang and Kodos observe humans, what they see is a species that repeatedly chooses the worst available option and then experiences genuine surprise at the outcome. They see a species that has organized its most important systems around the preferences of the least qualified members of those systems, that has elevated incompetence to institutional leadership with a consistency that suggests the elevation is not accidental, that has built elaborate structures of mutual reassurance against the recognition of its own predicament. They find this fascinating rather than horrifying, which is the show's most honest position on Springfield. The appropriate response to Springfield from outside its gravitational field is not outrage. It is the specific mixture of recognition and bewilderment that Kang and Kodos reliably produce. They are us, watching ourselves, from far enough away to see the whole picture. The tavern. What Moe's actually represents. Moe Cieslak runs the worst bar in Springfield, possibly in the state. Moe's Tavern is dim, slightly sticky, staffed by its owner's combination of genuine affection for his regulars and comprehensive resentment of everyone else, and visited by a specific subset of Springfield's male population who have found there a kind of home that their actual homes have failed to provide. Homer drinks at Moe's, Barney drinks at Moe's, Lenny and Carl drink at Moe's. The bar is one of the show's central recurring locations, as fixed and familiar in Springfield's geography as the Simpson house or the nuclear plant or the school. It is a place where things stay the same, which in Springfield is always a significant value. Moe himself is one of the show's most carefully written secondary characters, which is not something that is widely acknowledged. The bartender who is perpetually lonely, who has a history in boxing that ended badly, who has made several attempts at romantic connection that have all collapsed in ways specific to his particular combination of genuine feeling and catastrophic self-presentation, who answers his phone with a practiced resignation that suggests he has been waiting his entire life for a call he does not expect to come, is a character whose sadness the show has always been honest about. There is an episode in which Moe's Tavern is threatened with closure, and the regulars recognize what the bar has meant to them in a moment that the show allows to be genuine rather than comic. The bar is the place where none of them have to be anything other than what they are. No performance, no ambition, no gap between what they were supposed to become and what they became. At Moe's, the gap disappears, not because it has been closed, but because it has been agreed to be irrelevant for the duration of the visit. This is what bars are for, in communities where bars serve this function. They are the places where the show's evergreen terrace residents, men who have been reduced by their environments and their circumstances to something smaller than what they were capable of, can put down the performance of adequacy for a few hours and sit in a room with other people doing the same thing and feel, briefly, that the reduction is not the whole story. Moe's Tavern is not the show's darkest location. It is, in a specific way, its most honest one. Ralph Wiggum, the character the show cannot explain. Ralph Wiggum is Chief Wiggum's son. He is Lisa's classmate. He is one of the show's most beloved secondary characters, the source of some of its most quoted lines, the subject of a kind of warm, communal affection among viewers that is difficult to articulate and impossible to mistake. He is also the most cognitively unusual character in the show's entire population, which is a significant claim in a population that includes Homer Simpson and Hans Moleman. Ralph's responses to the world around him operate according to a logic that is internally consistent within itself, but that does not map onto the shared consensus reality that other characters inhabit. He makes connections that others cannot follow, but that, on examination, reveal an associative intelligence entirely unlike analytical intelligence, one that processes the world through a different set of pathways and arrives at different places from the same starting point. He is not simply confused. He is differently oriented. The show has never diagnosed Ralph with anything. It has never given his cognitive profile a name or an explanation. It presents his specific way of engaging with the world as a given, a feature of his character rather than a condition with a cause, and it treats him with consistent warmth without ever condescending to him or using his difference primarily as a source of mockery. The affection the show has for Ralph is genuine, and it comes through in how it handles him, which is with a lightness that never tips into cruelty. But Ralph exists in Springfield, and Springfield has been established as a place where the biological development of its residents has been affected by their environment. And Ralph exists as the son of a man who was working in the nuclear plant's vicinity when he was young, who was cured of his asthma by an antibiotic bomb deployed in a biological weapons laboratory, and who has been breathing Springfield's air and drinking Springfield's water his entire life. The show does not draw this connection. It never will. But Ralph sits in Lisa's classroom every episode, producing his specific and unrepeatable observations about the world in a town whose water and air have been established across many seasons to produce specific and unpredictable alterations in the biological development of the people who live there. He might be the most honest portrait Springfield has ever produced of what its environment actually does to its children. Section 17. The show's long goodbye. What 36 years does to a story. No television show was designed to run for 36 years. The Simpsons was created as a half-hour animated comedy for broadcast television, with the ambitions and the constraints of that format and that era. It found an audience and kept it. It found a creative peak and moved through it and beyond it. It became, without planning to become this, the longest continuously running scripted primetime series in the history of American television. This creates a specific narrative situation that the show has to manage in every episode. The situation of a story that should have ended but hasn't, that has continued past the natural boundary of its form, that carries the weight of its own history with it into every new episode in ways that the earlier seasons never had to manage. In the early seasons, every episode was building something. The characters were being defined. The world was being constructed. The relationships were being established. There was a direction to the accumulation, a sense that the show knew where it was going and was moving toward it with purpose. The comedy was in service of character revelation, and character revelation was in service of the larger project of building a fictional world that would sustain continued engagement. By season 15, by season 20, by season 30, the situation has changed completely. The characters are fully defined, have been fully defined for years. The world is completely constructed. Has been completely constructed for longer than some viewers have been alive. The relationships have been established, tested, challenged, resolved, and re-established multiple times. There is no more building to do. The only available project is maintenance. Maintenance is a different kind of creative work from construction. It requires different skills, different priorities, different sources of energy. It requires finding the new thing within the familiar structure rather than building the structure around the new thing. It requires the willingness to let the accumulated weight of the history be there, present in the room, without letting it paralyze the forward movement. It requires, above all, the ability to find genuine feeling in a situation that the creative team has been working in for so long that genuine feeling should by rights have been exhausted long ago. The show does this with variable success. Some later episodes find real emotional territory that the early seasons would not have had the accumulated weight to reach. Some later episodes feel like maintenance for its own sake, familiar movements through familiar arrangements without the energy that makes familiar movements feel like anything other than repetition. The range of quality in the later seasons is genuine and is itself a kind of honesty. The show's variable success at finding new life in an old form is documented in real time, across real episodes, without the editing that a later anthology could provide. The episodes that are only possible because of everything before them. There are moments in the show's later seasons that could not exist without the weight of the history behind them. Moments that work specifically because the audience has been watching this family for 20 or 25 or 30 years, and the accumulated investment converts what would otherwise be a small scene into something much larger. Homer and Marge in any episode that lets them be genuinely tender with each other, after 30 years of watching them navigate the specific difficulties of their specific marriage, carry a charge that no scene in the show's first season could have generated. The feeling is not produced by what is in the scene alone. It is produced by the combination of what is in the scene and everything that precedes it. All the episodes in which the marriage was tested and held and tested again and held again, and the knowledge that it will continue to be tested and continue to hold endlessly on the floating timeline where nothing changes and nothing ends. Bart and Lisa, when the show allows them to be genuinely kind to each other, not the usual adversarial comedy siblings, but the people they actually are to each other underneath the rivalry, which is a brother and a sister who understand each other better than anyone else in their world does, and who will never quite say so directly, is something that only works because of the decades of history. The scene is the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is 30 years. Even the callbacks to earlier seasons, the references that assume a deep familiarity with the show's history, function differently when the history is deep enough. An early season callback asks you to remember last season. A late season callback asks you to remember something from 20 years ago, and the fact that the audience does remember, that the audience carries the show's history with them into every new episode, is itself a kind of intimacy. The show knows its audience has been there for a long time. The audience knows the show has been there for a long time. The mutual knowing is a relationship. The show's own knowledge of what it is. The Simpsons has become increasingly self-aware across its run, in ways that range from productive to self-defeating depending on the specific instance. The show has always been formally inventive, always willing to break its own fourth wall when the break serves the comedy or the story, always comfortable with a kind of meta-awareness that most of its broadcast contemporaries avoided. In the later seasons, this meta-awareness has occasionally become the primary subject of an episode rather than a tool in service of some other subject. Episodes that are about the show's own history, about its cultural status, about its longevity, and its relationship to its own past, exist in a specific register that is different from both the early character-based comedy and the later celebrity-dense surrealism. They are the show talking to itself about itself, with the audience as witness. At its best, this produces something genuinely interesting. A self-examination conducted through the specific medium of the thing being examined. A show thinking through what it means to be, what it is, using the tools that define what it is. At its weakest, it produces episodes that feel like the show has substituted awareness of its own situation for engagement with the characters in the story. And the awareness, however accurate, does not generate the feeling that the engagement would. The show is aware of all this. It knows what it has become. It knows the criticisms, and it has addressed them, sometimes directly, sometimes obliquely, and its responses have been variable. The self-awareness is genuine. What it does with the self-awareness is the question, and the answer changes with each season and each writing room, and each specific moment. What the self-awareness cannot do is unmake what the show is. It cannot return the floating timeline to its early grounded quality. It cannot unexpand the premises that have expanded across 36 seasons of creative evolution. It cannot take back the celebrity appearances or the surreal premises or the tonal shifts that accumulated across the years in which the show was finding out what it was capable of being. The show is what it became. The awareness of what it became is part of what it is. And in its best moments, the awareness is not a limitation. It is the specific kind of wisdom that comes from having done something long enough to understand it from the inside. The show knows itself. Not everything it knows is comfortable. But it knows, and the knowing is there in the episodes for anyone who is watching at the right level. Section 18. The unified field all theories as one. Why they all point the same direction. We have spent a long time now following the threads. 12 main theories, dozens of supporting details, hundreds of specific pieces of evidence, spanning 36 seasons of a show that has been hiding things in its own surface for the entire duration of its run. And the thing that becomes visible when you lay all the theories next to each other, when you look at what each one is actually saying beneath its specific vocabulary and its specific evidence base, is that they are all saying the same thing. The radiation theory says, the people of Springfield have been harmed by their environment and cannot see the harm clearly enough to address it. The coma theory says, the story we have been watching is a dream, generated by love, refusing to end because ending means loss. The Burns conspiracy says, the harm is not accidental. Someone built the conditions that produce it and maintains them deliberately because the conditions serve his purposes. The collective denial theory says, the community knows, on some level, and has agreed not to know, because knowing would require action, and action would require courage, that the conditions of the community have specifically eroded. The prediction theory says the show is not separate from what it depicts. It is embedded in the culture it describes and participates in producing the conditions it satirizes. Every theory is a different angle on the same subject. The gap between what Springfield is and what Springfield believes itself to be, and the specific machinery that maintains the gap, and the specific cost that the machinery exacts from the people living inside it. The gap is maintained by radiation and by collective agreement, and by the specific engineering of individual psychologies, by the deliberate underfunding of institutions that would reduce it, by the legal and regulatory structures that have been shaped to serve the interests of the person who benefits most from its maintenance. The cost is paid by Homer, whose intelligence was taken from him before he was old enough to protect it, and by Mona, who spent 30 years separated from her son, and by Lisa, who is right about everything and cannot change anything, and by Ned, who does everything right and receives nothing for it, and by the town of Springfield, which votes every episode to maintain its comfortable fiction, and every episode pays the price of the maintenance. The show as love letter. If every theory converges on the same subject, then there must be something beneath the subject, something the theories are in service of, something that the whole elaborate structure is ultimately about. The show is a love letter. This is the only conclusion that accounts for all of it. It is a love letter to the dysfunctional, complicated, impossible, resilient family as a form, to the specific texture of domestic life in its most ordinary manifestations, the dinner that went wrong and got salvaged, the holiday that was ruined and became a story, the fight that felt terminal and didn't end the marriage, the child who was impossible and became someone you couldn't imagine having been without. The show has been writing this letter for 36 years, adding to it every season, returning to its central subject with the specific tenderness of something that loves what it examines, without being blind to what it examines. Homer loves his family with a completeness that the show has never once undermined, despite everything. Despite the crayon, despite the radiation, despite Burns, despite Mona's exile and Abe's compromise and Homer's own cascading limitations. The love is the constant. It is the one thing the contamination and the conspiracy and the corporate malevolence did not reach. It is the thing Burns did not account for when he spent decades engineering Homer's broken psychology. Burns made Homer compliant. He did not make Homer unloving. He could not have made Homer unloving because the love was not something the system could reach, not something the radiation could reduce, not something the crayon in his brain could prevent him from feeling with full force. This is the show's answer to all its own darkest questions. The answer is not optimistic in the sense of expecting improvement. The answer is not political in the sense of proposing solutions. The answer is personal and specific and quietly devastating. In a world organized against them, in a community that cannot see its own damage, in a family shaped by forces it cannot name, these specific people love each other. That is the constant. That is what survives everything the iceberg contains. Homer dreams of his family because they are worth dreaming about. Every episode is the dream choosing to continue, the sleeping brain refusing to release what it loves, the love itself functioning as the mechanism of the show's continuation. 788 episodes, 36 years. The same family on the same couch in the same house. Not because nothing ever changes, but because the thing that does not change is the only thing that matters. Maggie at the center. Everything converges on Maggie. Every theory, followed to its conclusion, arrives at Maggie. The radiation theory produces her as its most extreme positive case. The child whose mutation amplified, rather than reduced, who absorbed the same environmental exposure that diminished her father and became something extraordinary in the process. The coma theory produces her as Homer's deepest hope. The baby he cannot watch grow up, given in the dream a genius that exceeds measurement, the unconscious father's prayer for the child he cannot protect, rendered as cognitive superpower. The Burns conspiracy produces her as the variable Burns did not model. The child born into the system he built, growing up inside it, watching it, understanding it from the position of zero perceived threat, developing in the silence of her strategic invisibility a response that the system's design did not anticipate. The collective denial theory produces her as the coming disruption. The person who has been storing what the town has been choosing to forget, who has 36 years of accumulated evidence in a mind that cannot be reached by the contamination that reduced the evidence-gathering capacity of everyone around her, who is waiting for the moment when the accumulated weight becomes action. Maggie is the show's future and its answer, held in reserve for a finale that may never come, prepared across decades of careful invisibility, more dangerous to the systems of Springfield than anyone in Springfield has ever understood. She cannot walk without falling over. She cannot speak beyond sounds. She is 1 year old, and she has been 1 year old for 36 years, and she is the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace, and she is waiting, and she has always been waiting, and when she is done waiting, the thing she does will be something that Springfield, with all its mechanisms of denial and all its legal decrees against inconvenient truths, will not be able to absorb and forget. The baby who nobody suspects, the intelligence that cannot be measured, the silence that has been collecting everything for 3.5 decades. Springfield has never seen it coming. Springfield is constitutionally incapable of seeing it coming. That is exactly how she designed it. Closing, the loop, the love, and letting go. We came into Springfield from the surface where the yellow skin and the four fingers and the floating timeline live. We went through the background mysteries and the family secrets and the dark infrastructure and the Burns conspiracy and the murder that was never solved. We sat inside the coma dream and the radiation mutation and the collective denial and the prediction feedback loop. We examined the show's relationship with time and with itself and with the America it has been depicting and partially constructing for 36 years. We arrived, at the end of all of it, at the same place the show has always been pointing toward, underneath every joke and every reset and every impossible survival and every season that should have been the last but wasn't. A house on Evergreen Terrace, a family on a couch, a man who loves the people in his life with everything he has, which is simultaneously enough and never enough. A woman who holds the structure together through the force of her own quiet endurance. A boy who has been 10 years old for longer than most of his audience has been alive, pulling pranks in a world that does not deserve the energy he brings to the project of disrupting it. A girl who has been 8 years old for the same length of time, fighting the same fight with the same clarity and the same isolation and the same refusal to stop fighting. A baby watching all of it with enormous eyes and a silence that is either the deepest strategic intelligence in Springfield or the most heartbreaking limitation, and either way is the most important thing in the frame. The loop runs because we run it. We press play. We come back. We sit down on the couch that is every couch we ever sat on watching this show, and we go to Springfield. And Springfield is exactly as we left it. And the couch gag plays, and the music starts, and the family converges on the living room from their various directions, and Homer barely makes it to his seat before the garage door closes on him, and it has been exactly this way for 36 years, and it will be exactly this way for as long as we need it to be. Maybe that is what we need it to be, a place that stays. A family that does not age or leave or dissolve into the entropy that takes all things eventually. A set of people who will be exactly who they are next week and next year and in 10 years, waiting on the same couch, in the same house, on the same street, in the same town that cannot be found on any map, but that everyone who has ever watched the show knows by heart. The Simpsons Iceberg is not just a collection of mysteries and theories. It is the accumulated evidence of how much this show has meant to the people who have been watching it. Evidence of the attention and the love that millions of viewers have brought to something that appeared to be a cartoon about a dumb family and turned out to be, at its depths, something much more difficult to put down. The fish has 3 eyes. The plant is still leaking. Burns is still alive. Homer is still in Sector 7G. Lisa is still playing her saxophone. Bart is still 10 years old, which means the world he lives in still contains the possibility of being disrupted by someone who has not yet stopped believing that disruption is worth attempting. Section 9. The Treehouse of Horror as Confession. What the Halloween episodes actually do. Every October, The Simpsons steps outside its own rules. The Treehouse of Horror specials, which began in Season 2 and have aired annually since then, operate under a stated agreement with the audience. The events depicted are not canonical. Characters die and return. Physical laws dissolve entirely. The tonal register shifts from satire into something closer to actual horror or parody of horror, or a combination refined across 30-plus annual installments into something genuinely strange. Most viewers receive this framing as permission to enjoy the darkness without worrying about continuity. The Halloween episodes don't count. Enjoy the mayhem because the mayhem is contained. But the framing deserves examination because the Treehouse of Horror episodes don't explore darkness randomly. They explore specific darknesses. And the specific things the show chooses to do in its formally designated safe space, the things it says when the rules are suspended and consequences removed, follow patterns that are worth sitting with. The first Treehouse of Horror contained 3 segments: a haunted house story, a close adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, with Homer as the tormented narrator, an alien abduction story in which Homer and Bart are taken aboard a spacecraft. What the show chose to do in its very first Halloween episode, its first formal excursion beyond its own rules, was put Homer at the center of all 3 stories. Homer in the haunted house, Homer reading Poe, Homer abducted. The Treehouse episodes are always, at their deepest level, about what it would take to break Homer. They test him with monsters and aliens and parallel dimensions and death itself, in a space where the test can be made unlimited because the stakes are declared fictional in advance. And across 30 years of these tests, the show has found the same answer every time. Homer cannot be broken by anything the horror genre can generate. Death, damnation, transformation, cosmic insignificance. He absorbs all of it and returns to the couch. This is the same claim the regular episodes make, said Lauder, with more explicit violence, and in doing so, the Halloween specials function as an annual proof of the show's emotional thesis, that Homer's love for his family is not just a domestic virtue but something closer to a physical law. It cannot be undone by any force the show is willing to imagine. The fears the show returns to. Look across the Treehouse of Horror episodes for the anxieties the show circles, regardless of which horror genre it's borrowing from. Homer's intelligence, or the absence of it, appears repeatedly. One segment is built around the premise that Homer's brain is so minimal that alien intelligence trying to operate it from the inside can barely function. Another depicts Homer's stupidity as the specific thing that defeats a powerful supernatural force, because no intelligence can successfully predict behavior that has no underlying logic. The Halloween episodes use horror to make explicit what the regular episodes imply. Homer's cognitive limitations are simultaneously a disability and, in certain contexts, a form of protection. A man who cannot understand the threat is a man the threat cannot fully reach. The fog is impenetrable to any intelligence operating according to normal cause and effect. Burns appears in the Halloween episodes more than almost any other secondary character, and his appearances tend toward the cosmic. He is Dracula, explicitly, in one of the most memorable segments. The Dracula reading maps his relationship with Springfield in terms that the regular episodes dress in economic language. The Halloween episode strips the dressing away. Burns lives by extracting life from the community around him. He is ancient beyond normal reckoning. His survival depends on the continued vulnerability of the people he has arranged around himself. The horror frame says what the comedy frame can only suggest. The recurring structure. There is a structural pattern in the Treehouse episodes that appears so consistently it can only be intentional. The family is threatened by an external force. The force is vastly more powerful than the family. The family should, by any reasonable calculation, be destroyed. They are not destroyed. They survive. Through some combination of Homer's improbable resilience, the family's collective adaptability, and the specific kind of luck that attaches to people who love each other with enough consistency to confuse the universe's expectations about what they deserve. And then the episode ends, and the credits roll, and next week the threat is gone, and the family is exactly as they were. The Halloween episodes are the show stress-testing its own central claim. If the claim is true, if the family really is indestructible in the way the show needs it to be, then the horror format should not be able to break it. And it never does. Every year the format tries. Every year, the family survives. The test confirms the thesis. The love holds. This is the show reassuring itself. 36 annual confirmations that the thing it is protecting is actually there, actually survivable, actually worth protecting. The Treehouse of Horror is not a departure from the show's concerns. It is the show's concerns stated in the loudest available register and verified once per year before returning to the quieter register of the regular season. Section 10. The supporting cast as complete world. Apu and the distance between qualification and opportunity. Apu Nahasapima holds a doctorate in computer science from the Calculus Institute of Technology in Calcutta, where he graduated first in a class of 7 million students. He is fluent in multiple languages. He demonstrates, in the episodes where the show gives him room to move, an intelligence and a cultural range that exceeds most of Springfield's residents. He runs a convenience store. He runs it with extraordinary devotion. He works hours that would constitute a public health concern if they were applied to any other employee. He maintains the quick E-Mart to standards that exceed what the business formally requires. He treats the store as something worth caring about, rather than simply a thing he is paid to manage. The show has engaged with Apu's character with varying degrees of sensitivity and self-awareness across its run, and the public conversation about that engagement is part of the character's public biography. But underneath the debate, there is something about Apu's position in Springfield that the show has been honest about in its better moments. Apu represents the specific gap between what someone is capable of and what their position in a specific community allows them to do with that capacity. His doctorate and his graduating rank exist alongside his position behind the counter, and the gap between them is not explained by any failure on his part. It is explained by the structure of the community he moved into and the specific constraints that structure places on people arriving into it from particular directions. Springfield is full of people doing work below what they are capable of. Homer's capacity without the crayon is substantially higher than his capacity with it, and we have seen the without crayon version. Marge's organizational and emotional intelligence would serve well in demanding professional contexts, but is directed entirely inward. Apu has a doctorate and sells squishies. The community's consistent failure to match people to work they are suited for, and its consistent success at keeping them in positions that serve the existing structure, is one of the show's most persistent quiet observations about American labor. Chief Wiggum. Authority without accountability. Chief Clancy Wiggum has been the head of Springfield's police department for the entirety of the show's run. He has remained in this position despite a professional record that would, in any functionally accountable institution, have produced consequences long before the current season. His incompetence is documented across hundreds of episodes. He arrests the wrong people. He misidentifies suspects. He provides false testimony. He loses evidence. He falls asleep on duty. He accepts payments that compromise his professional obligations with the casual ease of someone who has never seriously contemplated that the obligations and the payments should be in conflict. He is also a father who loves his son Ralph, with a quality of affection that the show has depicted with more care than it sometimes receives credit for. The Wiggum-Ralph relationship, the devoted parent, and the child whose cognitive profile is genuinely unlike anything in the show's population, is one of the show's less examined and more quietly affecting long-term emotional threads. Wiggum loves Ralph without condition and without caveat, in the specific way that parents of children whose differences make conventional achievement unavailable learn that love and achievement have nothing to do with each other. The show uses Wiggum's professional incompetence as comedy and his paternal love as counterweight. The combination produces a character who is simultaneously a portrait of institutional dysfunction and a meditation on what love looks like when it must exist entirely separate from any worldly success. But Wiggum's position in Springfield's power structure matters beyond his comedy role. He is the head of law enforcement in a community with documented organized crime, a corrupt mayor, a billionaire whose facility has hundreds of safety violations, and a population that has been continuously harmed by its environment without any legal response. Wiggum is the specific mechanism through which all of this continues unaddressed. Not through evil or deliberate conspiracy, but through the specific combination of incompetence, comfort with the existing arrangement, and carefully maintained incuriosity that allows harm to persist in communities that lack the will to address it. He was, as a young man, accidentally cured of his asthma by the antibiotic bomb that Mona Simpson's activist group deployed against Burns's biological weapons laboratory. The man whose professional incompetence protects Burns's operations from legal accountability was personally helped by the woman who tried to destroy part of that operation. The show planted this detail in the backstory and left it there, visible and unaddressed, for anyone paying the right kind of attention. Moe and the honesty of the bar. Moe Cieslak runs the worst bar in Springfield. Dim, slightly sticky, staffed by its owner's combination of genuine affection for his regulars and comprehensive suspicion of everyone else, visited by a specific subset of Springfield's male population who have found there a form of home their actual homes have failed to provide. The bar is the place where the gap disappears. Not closes, disappears. The gap between what Homer was supposed to become and what he became, between what the circumstances of his life were supposed to deliver and what they actually delivered, is present everywhere in Homer's life except at Moe's. At the bar, the gap is irrelevant. Nobody at the bar is measuring against a standard of achievement. Nobody is performing adequacy. Everyone present has agreed, by being present, that this is sufficient. This room, this company, this hour that does not require anything from anyone. This is what certain bars are for. They are the places where people who have been reduced by their circumstances can set down the reduction for a while and simply exist alongside other people doing the same thing. Moe's Tavern is not the show's darkest location, in a specific way, because it is the one place where the pretense drops and what remains is simply people who know each other and don't require anything from each other. It is the show's most honest one. Moe himself is one of the show's most carefully drawn secondary characters. The loneliness is real and the show does not sentimentalize it. His attempts at connection have failed consistently and specifically. His boxing history ended badly, and the bad ending left marks. His answer to the phone, a practiced resignation that suggests he has been waiting his whole life for a call he genuinely does not expect to come, is the kind of character detail that takes years to build and functions, once built, as a complete biography in a single recurring beat. He is, among other things, the show's portrait of what Springfield does to the people it does not destroy. It diminishes them by degrees, quietly, over years, until they are comfortable in the diminishment. Not broken, not defeated, just reduced to a size that fits the available space. Moe fits the space of the bar. He built the bar to fit, and every night the regulars come in and the space is sufficient, and the gap does not matter for a few hours, and then they go home to where the gap lives. Groundskeeper Willie. Labor without dignity. Groundskeeper Willie maintains the grounds of Springfield Elementary. He has been doing this for the entire run of the show, in conditions that constitute a catalog of labor violations, compensated at a level that makes his choice of accommodation a matter of necessity rather than preference, given less institutional respect than any other regular employee of the school. He is also, physically, one of the most imposing characters in the show's universe. The gap between his physical capabilities and his social position is one of the show's most consistent, quiet observations about the relationship between physical labor and social status. Willie could, in any reasonable assessment of his attributes, do demanding work in almost any physically challenging context. He is in Springfield Elementary's boiler room, maintaining a school that cannot afford to properly compensate him, in a community that barely registers his existence. His backstory, revealed across various episodes, involves Scotland and a history of hard circumstance and the specific kind of pride and craft that comes from people who have learned that the work itself is the only part of labor that cannot be taken from you. He cares about the grounds. He takes the work seriously even when nobody else does, even when the institution he serves has made clear through its compensation and its facilities and its general treatment of him that the work and the person doing it are not valued. Willie is the show's portrait of labor that exists outside the categories the show's comfortable middle-class characters inhabit. He is not a professional. He is not a business owner or a clerk or a teacher or a safety inspector. He is a man who does physical work in an institution that needs the work done but would prefer not to think too carefully about the person doing it. This is a very large category of people in actual American communities, and Springfield's version of it is Willie, and the show has treated him with more dignity than the community he works for has ever managed. Section 11. The show's long goodbye. What 36 years does to a story. No television show was designed to run for 36 years. The Simpsons was created as a half-hour animated comedy for broadcast television, with the ambitions and constraints appropriate to that format and that era. It found an audience and kept it. It found a creative peak and moved through it and beyond it. It became, without planning for this, the longest continuously running scripted primetime series in the history of American television. This creates a specific narrative situation that the show must manage in every episode. The situation of a story that should have ended but hasn't, that has continued past the natural boundary of its form, that carries the weight of its own history into every new episode in ways the earlier seasons never had to manage. In the early seasons, every episode was building something. The characters were being defined. The world was being constructed. The relationships were being established. There was a direction to the accumulation. The comedies served character revelation, and character revelation served the larger project of building a world that would sustain continued engagement. By season 20, the situation has changed completely. The characters are fully defined, have been fully defined for years. The world is completely constructed. The relationships have been established, tested, challenged, resolved, and re-established multiple times. There is no more building to do. The only available project is maintenance. Maintenance is a different kind of creative work from construction. It requires finding the new thing within the familiar structure rather than building the structure around the new thing. It requires the willingness to let the accumulated weight of the history be present without letting it become paralysis. It requires above all the ability to find genuine feeling in a situation that the creative team has been working in for so long that genuine feeling should by rights have been exhausted years ago. The show does this with variable success. Some later episodes find real emotional territory that the early seasons would not have had the accumulated weight to reach. Some episodes feel like maintenance for its own sake, familiar movements through familiar arrangements. The range of quality in the later seasons is genuine and is itself a form of honesty. The show's variable success at finding new life in an old form is documented in real time, across real episodes, without the editing that retrospect would allow. The weight of the record. There is something the later seasons have that the early ones cannot, and it is not momentum or freshness or the creative energy of a show finding out what it is. It is weight. The weight of 30-something years of watching the same people in the same house in the same town. When Homer and Marge have a tender moment in a season 28 episode, that moment carries everything that preceded it. Every fight, every reconciliation, every episode in which the marriage was tested and held. Every time Homer did something catastrophically wrong and Marge had to decide, again, whether to stay, every time she stayed. The specific emotional charge of the later season tender moment is inseparable from the accumulated history that makes the tenderness meaningful. A season 1 Homer and Marge moment is moving because it is well written. A season 28 moment can be moving for the same reason, and also because you have been watching these two people for decades, and the fact that they are still there, still choosing each other, still finding their way back to each other after whatever the episode put between them, is itself the content. The later seasons cannot be the early seasons. That window closed years ago. But the later seasons can do something the early seasons could not, which is demonstrate that the thing the early seasons built has lasted. That the family the show constructed across its first decade has survived 30 years of everything the show has thrown at it. That the couch is still there and the house is still standing and the marriage is still intact and the children are still young and the love is still present, this is not a small thing. In a culture that discards things quickly, that moves on from attachments before they deepen into something harder to release, that treats duration itself as a form of failure, a story that has been running for 36 years and that has maintained the same central emotional commitment across all of them is making an argument about persistence that the argument itself cannot make as clearly as the mere fact of its continuing to exist. The flash-forward episodes as promise and refusal. Lisa's wedding from season 6 is the most fully realized of the show's flash-forward episodes. The episode moves approximately 15 years forward, showing Lisa as a 23-year-old woman engaged to a young British man. What the future depicts is detailed and emotionally specific. Lisa has become the kind of person the show has been building toward. Intellectually accomplished, emotionally complex, still searching for connection, and still finding it difficult to locate in a world that has made different accommodations with its own limitations than she has made with hers. Homer is older. Marge is older. Bart has taken a path that is specific to him and legible to anyone who has been watching for 6 seasons. The future Springfield has is a future that follows from the Springfield that exists, which is both reassuring and slightly melancholy, because the future that follows from the existing Springfield contains its own limitations. The episode proves something important. The Simpsons can imagine its characters as adults. It has thought about what they would become in specific detail, has drawn and written and voiced those futures, has sat inside them long enough to make them emotionally real. The flash forward works. It is affecting. It gives you something you did not know you wanted, which is the specific feeling of watching a child you have known for 6 years become an adult. And then the episode ends and Lisa is 8. The window closes. The possible future is returned to hypothetical status. The floating timeline reasserts itself. The show does not keep these futures because keeping them would require it to become something other than what it is. The choice not to age the characters is not a failure of imagination or a creative limitation. It is a deliberate decision made by people who understand exactly what they are choosing not to do, and the flash-forward episodes are the clearest evidence that they understand it. They have looked at the alternative. They have depicted it with care and feeling, and they have chosen to come back. Section 12. The smaller mysteries. The Sideshow Bob pattern nobody talks about. We have discussed Sideshow Bob's institutional situation, the parole system that keeps releasing him, the police department that cannot contain him, the community that keeps receiving him back. But there is a detail within Bob's specific criminal history that tends to get overlooked in the discussion of his general menace. Bob's plans are consistently brilliant. His executions are consistently undermined by a single flaw: theatrical excess. He cannot complete an act of violence without first announcing it, explaining it, ensuring that his target appreciates the intelligence and elegance of the method before the method is applied. He is, in the most specific available sense, a man who needs to be understood more urgently than he needs to succeed. The murder is secondary to the recognition that he is clever enough to have conceived it. This is a very specific psychological profile. It is the profile of someone for whom competence has never translated into acknowledgement, who has spent their life being more capable than the situations they inhabit allow them to demonstrate, who has developed a compulsive need to make the demonstration before taking the action, because the demonstration is, at some level, more important than the action. Bob went to prison for the first time because he framed Krusty for armed robbery. The framing was clever. It worked. Krusty went to prison. And then Bob could not resist revealing that he had done it because the cleverness of having done it was the point, and the cleverness was wasted if nobody knew about it. He is the show's most extended portrait of intelligence in service of the wrong goal. All that capability, all that education and cultural range and strategic thinking, directed toward the murder of a child, explained in elaborate detail before it can be executed, derailed by its own compulsive need for acknowledgement. Every failed plan is a man who needed to be seen more than he needed to succeed, who chose visibility over victory every single time, who could not stop himself. The show finds this funny. It also quietly finds it genuinely tragic, and the episodes that let Bob's loneliness be visible rather than submerging it in villainy are the ones that treat the character with the full complexity he deserves. Ralph Wiggum, Springfield's clearest evidence. Ralph Wiggum is Chief Wiggum's son. He is Lisa's classmate. He is the source of some of the show's most quoted lines, and he has inspired in the show's audience a quality of warm, helpless affection that is difficult to articulate and impossible to mistake. He is also the most cognitively unusual character in Springfield, which is a significant claim in a population that includes Homer Simpson and Hans Moleman. Ralph's engagement with the world operates according to a logic that is internally consistent within itself, but does not map onto the shared consensus reality that other characters inhabit. He makes connections that others cannot follow, but that, on examination, reveal an associative intelligence entirely unlike analytical intelligence, one that processes experience through pathways that are genuinely different from the norm, and arrives at places that the norm would not reach from the same starting point. He is not confused. He is differently oriented. The show has never given Ralph's cognitive profile a name or an explanation. It treats his specific way of being in the world as a given, as a feature of his character rather than a condition with a traceable cause, and it handles him consistently with a warmth that never tips into exploitation. The affection is genuine and it shows. But Ralph exists in Springfield. He is the son of a man who worked near the nuclear facility when he was young. He drinks the same water and breathes the same air as everyone else in the community. He sits in the same classroom that burns underfunded by extracting its oil. He is a child of Springfield in the most complete available sense. The radiation theory has a specific account of what the environmental contamination produces at the far ends of the spectrum. Homer at the diminished end, Maggie at the amplified end. Ralph sits somewhere on that spectrum, in a position that is neither diminished nor amplified in any simple sense, but genuinely altered in ways that make him different from the baseline of human cognitive development. He might be the most honest portrait Springfield has ever produced of what its environment actually does to its children. Not the dramatic cases, not the extremes at either end, but the middle of the distribution, where the alteration produces something that is not broken and not extraordinary, but is genuinely and persistently different from what the unaltered version would have been. The Quick E-Mart at 3 a.m. One episode, across the entire run of the show, follows a character through a late-night shift at the Quick E-Mart. It is the kind of episode that the show does occasionally, taking a premise that exists primarily as a location and asking what it would actually feel like to inhabit it for a sustained period. What the episode shows, briefly and without particular emphasis, is the specific quality of late-night retail time. The fluorescent lights and the empty aisles and the succession of customers who are there because they need something at a time when getting it requires being in this specific kind of place. Not a grocery store, which has normal hours and normal social textures. A convenience store, open always, whose customers at 3 in the morning are people whose needs did not fit the normal schedule. This is a very small piece of Springfield's texture, visible in one episode and then returned to background. But it is part of what the show has been building across hundreds of episodes, a sense that Springfield is a complete world that continues operating in all its parts, regardless of whether the camera is on any particular part. The Quickie Mart exists at 3 in the morning, whether or not any episode is set there. The power plant is running. Homer's house is dark and the family is asleep, and the town is running through its nighttime operations without being observed. The completeness of Springfield as a world is part of why the theories about it can reach the depth they do. You cannot build a conspiracy theory about a setting that feels thin or merely functional. Springfield feels thick enough, feels complete enough, feels like it contains more than is shown in any given episode because the show has been adding to it for 36 years, and the addition has been cumulative, and the result is a place that genuinely seems to have rooms you have not been in yet, corners of the town you have not yet visited, stories that have been happening in the background while the camera was somewhere else. Section 13. Burns as system. What Burns is, precisely. We have discussed Burns as character. His age, his medical situation, his relationship with Smithers, his history with the Simpson family, his biological weapons laboratory, his comprehensive management of Springfield's civic infrastructure. Now, let us discuss what Burns is, precisely, as a structural element of the show's universe. Burns is not a villain in the conventional sense of someone who wants bad things and acts to achieve them. Burns is a system. He is the personification of a set of institutional arrangements that produce harm as a byproduct of their normal operation, not because Burns wants to harm anyone, but because harm is the natural output of what the system is designed to do, which is concentrate resources and preserve existing arrangements. Burns wants to stay alive. Burns wants to maintain his wealth. Burns wants the power plant to keep running because the plant is the foundation of everything else. To stay alive, he needs the weekly treatments, which require money, which the plant generates. To maintain his wealth, he needs to minimize operating costs, which means not fixing the violations, which means not protecting the surrounding population. To keep the plant running, he needs a safety inspector whose incompetence ensures the violations continue without generating regulatory shutdown, which means Homer. None of this requires Burns to want anyone in Springfield to suffer. It requires Burns to structure his situation so that his own priorities are served, and the byproduct of that structuring is that everyone around him absorbs the costs. The radiation, the underfunded school, Homer's broken psychology, Mona's exile, Grandpa's compromised silence, these are not goals. They are outputs. The system produces them the way industrial processes produce waste, not because anyone designed them to be produced, but because they fall out of the arrangements that serve other purposes. This is the show's most sophisticated political observation, and the reason it has resonated across decades with audiences from different political contexts and different personal experiences of institutional power. Burns is not a special case of evil. Burns is what every system looks like when you personify it and let it speak. The specific features of his character, the obliviousness to the suffering he causes, the genuine bafflement when he encounters resistance to his preferences, the ease with which he uses and discards the people around him without any sense that he is doing something wrong, these are the features of institutional power, made specific and human and visible. He is not a monster, he is a mirror. What would happen without Burns? There is a thought experiment the show never directly performs, but whose outline it has provided enough material to sketch. What would Springfield look like without Burns? The easy answer is better, clean water, a funded school, a safe power plant or no power plant. A population with its full cognitive function, able to think clearly about its situation, able to make the connections between cause and effect that Burns's system has made so difficult to make. But the show has also shown, in the episodes where Burns's control is briefly absent, that the situation is more complicated than the easy answer suggests. When the German investors briefly owned the plant, they assessed the cost of compliance and nearly went bankrupt from the estimate. The violations accumulated over decades by Burns's operational model cannot be corrected overnight or cheaply. The damage to Springfield's environment and population is not reversible by removing the source of the damage. The contamination is in the water and the soil and the biological systems of everyone who has been living there. Removing Burns does not remove what Burns did. The economy of Springfield is organized around the plant. The employment of a significant portion of the workforce, the tax base, the electrical infrastructure, the web of financial relationships that extend from the plant into almost every sector of the town's economic life, all of it would need to be rebuilt if the plant closed. Not impossible, not even particularly difficult over a long enough horizon. But the immediate disruption of removing Burns from the center of Springfield's economy would produce its own kind of harm. This is what the show means when it says, in its darker moments, that Springfield cannot kill Burns, because Springfield cannot survive without Burns. It does not mean this in the sense that Burns is good for Springfield. It means it in the sense that a community whose entire infrastructure has been organized around a single point of extraction and control becomes, over time, dependent on the continuation of that arrangement, even when the arrangement is harmful. The dependency is itself a product of the extraction. You cannot remove the extractor without first rebuilding the infrastructure that the extraction prevented from developing. Springfield would survive without Burns, but not quickly, and not without difficulty, and not without a clarity about its own situation that 30 years of contaminated water and underfunded schools has made genuinely difficult to achieve. Section 14. The loop we built and what it costs. The choice to keep watching. We watch The Simpsons for different reasons at different times in our lives. The first time most viewers encounter the show, they are young enough that the comedy is the primary experience. The quick jokes, the visual gags, the character exaggerations, the specific Simpsons speed at which meaning is generated and released. The show is funny and it is fast and it is full of the specific kind of energy that well-executed satire has, the energy of intelligence applied to familiar things, and finding in them the absurdity that familiarity had hidden. Later, with more episodes behind you and more of your own life lived, other things start to come through. The sadness in Homer's situation becomes more visible. The exhaustion in Marge's patience becomes more legible. Lisa's isolation feels less like a character quirk and more like an accurate description of a particular experience of intelligence in communities not designed to accommodate it. Ned's pain becomes something other than comedy. The show starts to feel like it is talking about something real, something that the comedy surface was always delivering, but that required a certain amount of lived experience to fully receive. And later still, with enough seasons behind you and enough of your own life lived, that the people on the show are doing things you recognize not from general human experience, but from specific personal experience. The emotional layer becomes primary. The comedy is still there, and it is still funny, but it is the container rather than the content. What the show is delivering, at its most affecting moments, is the specific feeling of watching people you know navigate situations you recognize, and the comfort of knowing they will survive whatever this episode throws at them, and be back next week in exactly the same form, ready to do it again. This is the loop the show offers. A guaranteed return. A promise that the family will be there when you come back to it, unchanged, intact, ready to absorb whatever the next story requires and return to baseline. The loop is not a failure of the medium or a limitation of the form. It is the specific thing the show provides that almost nothing else does, a version of permanence in a culture that is relentlessly impermanent. What the loop costs? The loop has a cost that the show has been honest about, in its way, across its run. The cost is that nothing can change permanently. Every development is reversible, every consequence is temporary. Every step forward must eventually be walked back to preserve the eternal present. And the emotional investments the show invites, the genuine feelings that accumulate from years of watching these characters, are investments whose object is protected from the changes that would normally generate the deepest emotional experiences: growth, loss, transformation, the specific feeling of watching someone become something different from what they were. The show cannot give you those things without ending itself. It can give you the sensation of those things in flash-forward episodes and in the occasional genuinely affecting regular episode where something real happens that the comedy cannot fully contain. But it cannot commit to them. The floating timeline prevents commitment. The preservation of the eternal present is the condition of the loop's continuation, and the loop's continuation is the promise the show has been making to its audience for 36 years. This is not a complaint. It is an honest description of what the show is and what it costs to be that thing. The Simpsons offers permanence at the price of transformation. Whether that trade is worth it depends on what you most need from a story. If you need the story to grow and change and arrive somewhere different from where it started, the floating timeline will eventually frustrate you. If you need the story to be there, reliably, in the same form, with the same people, doing the same things with the same quality of attention and affection, then the trade is worth it. Most of the audience that has stayed with the show for decades has decided, implicitly, that the trade is worth it. That what the loop provides, the guaranteed return, the permanent family, the house that is always standing on Evergreen Terrace, is more valuable than the transformation that committing to time would allow. This is a human decision that each viewer makes privately, and that the show has been designed to facilitate across 36 years of careful loop maintenance. The show knows what it is offering. The audience knows what it is accepting. The loop runs because both parties want it to run. Why Bart cannot turn 11? Bart turning 11 would be a small thing, an age increment that real children navigate without particular difficulty or drama. But for The Simpsons, Bart turning 11 is the beginning of an exit. It is the first step on the path away from the specific configuration that the show has been maintaining since 1989, the first acknowledgement that the children are in motion, that the family is not static, that the loop cannot hold indefinitely. Bart at 11 is on his way to 12. 12 is on his way to 13. 13 is the beginning of the teenager, a different creature from the child, one whose relationship with the family is structured differently, whose concerns are different, whose capacity for the specific kind of disruption Bart currently provides would be transformed into something harder to love as uncomplicated comedy. Bart at 15 is a different show. Bart at 18 is a show the audience has never agreed to watch. So Bart stays 10, Lisa stays 8, Maggie stays 1. The ages are held because the specific configuration the ages define is worth holding. Homer's specific relationship with a 10-year-old Bart, the combination of frustration and genuine mutual affection, the strangling followed by the tender moment, is only available while Bart is 10, and Homer is the kind of father he is to a 10-year-old. Change either variable and the relationship changes in ways that might produce something equally interesting but would not produce the same thing. The show chose the same thing. The audience ratified the choice by continuing to watch. The loop runs. And somewhere in Springfield, in the eternal present of a town that does not appear on any map, Bart is pulling a prank on his father, and Lisa is playing her saxophone, and Maggie is watching everything from the high chair, and Homer is finding his way home from the plant for the 10,000th time, and Marge is managing what needs to be managed, and the house is standing, and the lights are on, and everything is exactly as it was and as it will be. The radiation is still in the water, Burns is still alive, the mystery is still open, the dream is still running. And none of that changes the fact that the couch is there and the family is on it and the music is playing. That has always been enough. For the audience and for Homer both. Closing. The loop, the love, and the long goodbye. We came into Springfield from the surface, where the yellow skin and the four fingers and the floating timeline live, where the show is most visible and most familiar and most comfortable to inhabit. We went through the background mysteries and the family secrets, and the dark infrastructure and the Burns conspiracy. We sat inside the coma dream, and the radiation mutation, and the collective denial, and the prediction feedback loop. We followed Mona Simpson's exile and Homer's broken psychology and Maggie's strategic silence. We watched a town vote to criminalize truth, and a safety inspector throw a donut into a reactor core, and a baby shoot a billionaire and get away with it, because babies cannot be prosecuted. We followed every thread down as far as it goes and arrived at the end of all of them at the same place. A house on Evergreen Terrace, a family on a couch, a man who loves the people in his life with everything he has, which is simultaneously enough and never enough. A woman who holds the structure together through the force of her own quiet endurance. A boy who has been 10 years old for longer than most of his audience has been alive, bringing an energy to the project of disrupting the world around him that the world has not yet figured out how to fully contain. A girl who has been 8 years old for the same length of time, fighting the same fight with the same clarity and the same isolation and the same refusal to stop. A baby watching all of it with enormous eyes and a silence that is either the deepest strategic intelligence in Springfield or the most heartbreaking limitation, and either way is the most important thing in the frame. All the theories converge here. The radiation and the dream and the conspiracy and the denial and the predictions and the locked timeline, every single one of them, followed to its conclusion, arrives at this family, on this couch, in this house, in a town that cannot be located on any map, but that everyone who has watched the show knows by heart. The show has been making one argument for 36 years. Not a political argument, not an environmental argument, not a conspiracy. A human argument. The argument is this: love is the constant. Whatever else is true about Springfield, whatever the plant has done and Burns has engineered and the collective agreement has buried and the dream has preserved, the love in this family is not reducible to any of it. The love survives the contamination. It survives the conspiracy. It survives the coma. It runs beneath all of it, unaffected, the one constant in a universe of variables, the one thing the system that shapes everything else in Springfield cannot reach. Homer works for the man who destroyed his family. He does not know this. The crayon and the radiation and 30 years of managed cognitive diminishment have made the connection impossible for him to form. But he loves Marge with everything he has. He loves his children with everything he has. He stumbles home from Sector 7G, and he finds his way to the couch, and the family is there, and that is the whole story. The one that has been running since 1989. The one that will keep running for as long as we need it to. The loop runs because we built it and we maintain it. We press play. We come back. We sit down on the couch that is every couch we ever sat on watching this show, in whatever house we were in, at whatever age we were when we first found them, and we go to Springfield, and Springfield is exactly as we left it. Maybe that is what we need from it. A place that stays. A family that does not age or leave or dissolve into the entropy that takes all things eventually. A set of people who will be exactly who they are next week and next year and in 10 years, waiting on the same couch, in the same house, on the same street, in a town that cannot be found on any map, but that everyone who has ever watched the show knows how to reach. The fish still has 3 eyes. The plant is still leaking. Burns is still alive. Homer is still in Sector 7G. Lisa is still playing her saxophone in her bedroom, alone, right about everything, continuing anyway. Bart is still 10 years old, which means the world he lives in still contains the possibility of being disrupted by someone who has not yet stopped believing disruption is worth the attempt. And Maggie is still watching, still waiting, still knowing everything she knows behind those enormous eyes, in that deliberate silence that is either the deepest strategic intelligence Springfield has ever produced or the most heartbreaking limitation, and is probably both simultaneously, which is how the most important things tend to be. She will act when the time is right. She has been getting ready for 36 years, and Springfield, with all its mechanisms of denial and all its legal decrees against inconvenient truths and all the infrastructure Burns built to make accountability impossible, will not see it coming. Because that is exactly how Maggie designed it. And until that moment comes, the loop runs. The dream continues. The family stays together on the couch, and somewhere in a hospital in Springfield that does not appear on any map, a man who loves his family more than anything in the world is holding on to the only thing that has ever mattered to him: the couch, the house, the people, preserved in amber, in a town that never changes, in a show that never ends, in the dream that chooses, every week, not to stop. Good night, Springfield. We'll see you next week. Thank you for watching. Drop a comment below with the detail that stayed with you longest, and if you want more of this, you know what to do. Extended Deep Dive: The Radiation Theory, Every Piece of Evidence. Building the full case from the ground up. We have visited the radiation theory at multiple points throughout this video, touching its edges, noting its implications, allowing it to accumulate context. The case deserves a thorough and careful treatment, laying out every piece of canonical evidence in sequence so that the full structure of the argument is visible. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned by Charles Montgomery Burns. It has been operational for the entire run of the show and, given what the canonical backstory reveals about Burns's history in Springfield, for a significant period before the show's events begin. It is the primary source of electrical power for the entire community and the largest single employer in the town's economy. A surprise safety inspection found 342 violations. The estimated cost to bring the facility into compliance was $56 million. Burns refused to pay it, not because the sum was beyond his means, he is a billionaire many times over, but because fixing the violations would require acknowledging they existed. Acknowledging they existed would invite questions about what those violations had already done to the surrounding community over the years they had been accumulating. The violations include direct dumping of radioactive waste into local water bodies, radioactive waste disposed of on the grounds of Springfield Elementary School, plutonium used as a paperweight on an employee's desk, cooling towers with structural cracks patched with chewing gum, rats in the facility's infrastructure that emit visible light, which means the radioactive contamination has penetrated deep enough into the building's substrate to affect its rodent population. Human skeletons in the basement, shown once, never explained, never investigated. The safety inspector, whose professional mandate is to identify these violations and require their correction, is Homer Simpson. Homer has held this position for the entirety of the show's run. His IQ is described by the show's creator as 55. He sleeps at his workstation. He has caused nuclear incidents through direct personal negligence. He once threw food into the reactor core to see what would happen. He has been standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe for 3.5 decades. He was selected for this role and retained in this role not despite his unsuitability, but because his unsuitability serves specific purposes. The population-level evidence. The physical characteristics of Springfield's permanent population are consistent across the entire population and are specific to people who live in Springfield rather than universal to all characters in the show's universe. Yellow skin. This is the detail that every viewer has noticed and every viewer has absorbed as art style. But the art style explanation does not account for the visual difference between Springfield residents and non-Springfield characters in the same frame. Guest characters are drawn with different proportions. Visitors from outside the community look different from the people who live there. The yellow skin is specific to Springfield residents. Within the show's own internal visual logic, it is not a universal artistic convention. It is a characteristic of a particular population. 4 fingers, same pattern, same explanation problem. Same visual differentiation between permanent residents and visitors that suggests the 4 fingers are information rather than convention. Physical proportions that follow a consistent pattern across the population. Enlarged eyes, prominent jaw structure, body types that share specific features in ways that suggest a common cause rather than natural variation. These proportions are different from those of non-Springfield characters appearing in the same episodes. Now add the behavioral and cognitive profile of Springfield's population as a whole. The town is remarkable for its collective inability to maintain sustained critical analysis of the systems that govern it. Municipal policy changes are accepted with minimal sustained resistance. The same patterns of exploitation recur season after season without generating effective organized response. The population responds to immediate stimuli intensely and forgets them quickly. Long-term cause and effect connections, the kind that would allow residents to trace their situation back to its source, are consistently not made. This cognitive profile is consistent with the neurological effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure in a population, not catastrophic acute exposure, which would produce visible illness and rapid death. Chronic, low-level, long-term exposure that reduces cognitive function gradually across decades in ways that are undetectable in any individual case because the reduction is slow enough to feel like normal variation, but detectable at the population level because the reduction is consistent and patterned. The Blinky syllogism. The three-eyed fish is the simplest piece of evidence and the most irrefutable. A fish was caught in the river downstream of the nuclear power plant. The fish had 3 eyes. This is the show's explicit, unambiguous canonical demonstration that the radioactive contamination from the plant has altered the biology of organisms living in the affected water supply. The same water supply serves the human population of Springfield. If the contamination is severe enough to cause observable genetic mutation in fish within 1 generation, the contamination is severe enough to cause biological changes in humans consuming the water across multiple generations. This is the entire argument. Everything else is elaboration. The three-eyed fish appeared in Season 2, and the show has been elaborating on its implications ever since, across hundreds of episodes, without ever explicitly stating the conclusion. Springfield has been providing the conclusion through its population's characteristics. The conclusion is visible in the yellow skin, and the 4 fingers, and the cognitive profile, and the physical proportions, and Hans Mollmann's catastrophically premature aging, and Ralph Wiggum's genuinely unusual cognitive profile, and Maggie's extraordinary intelligence, and Homer's specific kind of damage. The show shows you the fish in Season 2. The show shows you 34 more seasons of what the same water produces in human beings. It trusts you to connect the data points. Most viewers don't, because the comedy surface is very effective at preventing that kind of analytical engagement. But the data points are there. They have always been there. Burns as the proof of long-term exposure? Burns is the show's most direct evidence for the radiation theory, hiding in the character that everyone has been watching since the first season. Burns requires weekly radiation treatments to survive. This is canonical, established clearly in the Springfield Files episode, and presented as settled fact rather than as hypothesis. Without the treatments, he dies within a week. His survival is scheduled maintenance, not natural biological function. His body cannot sustain itself without external radioactive input. His body has every disease known to medical science, all simultaneously. The diseases are held in equilibrium by the treatment, a biological gridlock that prevents any single illness from progressing to the point of killing him. This is presented as a comic medical diagnosis, and it is also a precise description of what a human body looks like after more than a century of managed proximity to nuclear material with sufficient resources to maintain the specific medical protocol that keeps the system in balance. Burns is the extreme long-term case. He is what happens to a human biology after over 100 years of nuclear proximity, when that biology has access to the best available medical management. His body has been so fundamentally altered by the long-term exposure that it no longer functions as a normal human body. It functions as a system that requires nuclear input. The diseases, the equilibrium, the weekly maintenance, these are the features of a biological system that has been running on a different fuel source for so long that it cannot return to normal function. Springfield's population is at an earlier stage of the same process. They are living with the effects of decades rather than a century of exposure, and without access to the medical resources Burns uses to manage those effects. The characteristics they display, the yellow skin, the 4 fingers, the cognitive profile, the physical proportions, are the earlier stage version of the same long-term adaptation that Burns represents at its extreme. Burns is not just operating the facility that is contaminating Springfield. He is the most visible evidence that the contamination is real, that it does something specific and observable to biological systems, and that the something it does is both manageable with sufficient resources and catastrophic without them. He knows this. He is the proof of it, and he has been running the proof publicly for the entire run of the show, glowing slightly after his weekly treatments, living in perfect, diseased equilibrium, the oldest man in Springfield, 100 years, and more of managed nuclear adaptation, walking around in a 3-piece suit. The self-concealing mechanism. The radiation theory has one apparent problem, and the show addresses it directly through Homer. The problem is this: if the contamination is doing what the theory claims, why has nobody in Springfield noticed? Why has nobody connected the yellow skin and the four fingers and the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and constructed the argument that should be obvious from these components? The answer is Homer. The answer is what the crayon removal episode reveals, that without the cognitive limitation the crayon imposes, Homer is intelligent enough to see Springfield for what it is. And seeing Springfield for what it is, when you live inside it and depend on it and have organized your entire life around it, is unbearable. Smart Homer understood what his job actually was, what his employer actually was, what the water he drank and the air he breathed were doing to him, and he chose stupidity because the alternative was a clarity he could not survive in. But here is the deeper point. Homer chose the fog. Most of Springfield did not choose it. The fog was imposed on them, gradually, through the same process that imposed it on Homer, through the contaminated water and the irradiated air, and the decades of managed cognitive reduction that have made the population of Springfield exactly what Burns needs them to be: present, functional enough to work and consume and pay their electric bills, and unable to sustain the critical analysis that would connect the dots between their situation and its cause. The contamination is self-concealing. The radioactive material that alters the biology of Springfield's residents also damages the neurological infrastructure that would allow those residents to notice the alteration and trace it to its source. The poison produces the condition that prevents its own recognition. You cannot notice the fog from inside the fog. Burns did not engineer this. He did not design the self-concealing mechanism into the contamination. He simply refused to fix the violations, and the violations kept doing what unaddressed industrial contamination does, and the population kept absorbing the output, and the cognitive effects accumulated over generations, and the result is a town that cannot see its own situation clearly enough to address it. He benefited from this outcome without planning it. The self-concealing nature of the contamination is the most profound of all Burns's advantages over Springfield, and it is the one he did not have to build. The contamination built it for him. The one thing he needed, a population unable to challenge his operation, was produced by his operation as a side effect. This is the most efficient conspiracy imaginable. The conspiracy that requires no ongoing coordination because the mechanism maintains itself. The exploitation that does not need to be actively enforced because the conditions it created prevent the resistance that would require enforcement. Springfield is not held in place by Burns's active management. Springfield is held in place by what Burns did to Springfield decades ago, and by the cumulative effect of what he has continued doing since, and by the fact that the people most positioned to challenge the arrangement are the people the arrangement has most thoroughly compromised. Extended analysis. The coma theory, the complete emotional case. Why this theory resonates at a frequency, the others don't. The radiation theory is intellectually satisfying. The Burns conspiracy is politically resonant. The collective denial theory is sociologically precise. But the coma theory does something none of the others do. It breaks your heart. Not because Homer is in a coma, if he is. Not because the show's events might be a dream. These are technically interesting propositions. The coma theory breaks your heart because of what it reveals about the specific content of the dream. If Homer has been dreaming since April 1993, then the dream is the answer to the question, what does Homer Simpson most want? And the answer, delivered across 32 years of post-coma episodes, is not complicated. Homer wants his family to stay together. He wants his children to stay young. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Friday night in the house on Evergreen Terrace to last forever. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous little boy, the one he can strangle with theatrical frustration and hug with genuine warmth in the same sequence. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone in the next room, to still be the daughter he does not understand but loves completely. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold. The dream gives him all of this, every single episode. Without fail, the dream returns the family to baseline. Whatever catastrophe the episode required, whatever consequence should have been permanent, the dream absorbs it and returns everything to the configuration that Homer most wants to preserve. The reset is not lazy writing. The reset is the dreaming brain's refusal to let the thing it loves change in ways that cannot be undone. Homer's brain will not age his children because it does not have the reference material. He went under before they grew up, and in the absence of that information, the dream keeps them at the last age. His memory holds clearly. Homer's brain will not end the marriage because the marriage is the thing the dream is most fundamentally about. The specific love between a man of limited capacity and a woman who chose him anyway, who keeps choosing him, who will always choose him in the dream, because in the dream he never has to find out what happens when she stops. This is the coma theory's emotional argument. Not that Homer is unconscious, but that his unconsciousness reveals what he values most. The dream is a self-portrait. The content of the dream is the content of Homer's heart. And his heart, whatever the radiation has done to his brain, whatever Burns has done to his psychology, whatever the crayon and the contaminated water and the engineered brokenness have done to his capacity for critical thinking, his heart is intact. His heart is the one thing the system did not reach. The evidence that cannot be explained away. Let us be precise about what the coma theory explains that no alternative explanation can account for as cleanly. The tonal shift. Before April 1993, the show is grounded. The stories are about recognizable human problems seen through comedy, financial stress, marital tension, educational failure. The emotional stakes are domestic and believable. After April 1993, the show escalates beyond anything the first 4 seasons suggested it was capable of. Homer goes to space. Burns captures mythological creatures. Homer joins secret societies. Homer meets God multiple times. Homer holds hundreds of different jobs. Homer travels the world. The escalation is consistent across every subsequent season, and it begins precisely with the coma episode. No other theory accounts for why the change begins exactly where it begins. The collective denial theory does not explain it. The radiation theory does not explain it. The Burns conspiracy does not explain it. The tonal shift is a specific feature of the show's history that requires a specific explanation, and the coma theory provides the only explanation that matches the specificity of the evidence. The celebrity flood. The show's later seasons are saturated with celebrity guest appearances in ways the early seasons were not. The celebrities appear as themselves, increasingly, rather than as characters within Springfield's universe. From outside the theory, this reads as the show's increasing reliance on novelty to sustain interest. From inside the coma theory, it reads as exactly what coma research suggests. The dreaming brain of an unconscious patient incorporates fragments of external stimulus, sounds and voices and names that reach it through the fog of unconsciousness, and weaves them into the dream's ongoing narrative. Homer's brain is absorbing the ambient sounds of the hospital room, the television, the visitors' conversations, the medical staff's references to the outside world. Names it recognizes become characters. Voices it identifies become guests. The celebrity flood is not the show reaching for novelty. It is Homer's brain pulling in the radio frequency of the outside world and writing it into the dream because the dream is running low on material that the brain can generate from its own memory. God's warning. In the season 4 premiere, 6 months before the coma episode, God tells Homer that his time is coming, not metaphorically. In explicit dialogue, in a direct conversation, God indicates to Homer that something significant is approaching and that Homer's conscious experience of the world is going to change. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The coma theory is the only reading of the show in which this detail is not a throwaway gag from a theologically comic episode. Under the coma theory, it is a prophecy delivered in the specific format that Springfield uses for prophecy, which is the format of comedy that contains something more serious than it appears to. God told Homer his time was coming. God's timeline was accurate. What the show does when it confirms and denies. The season 34 episode that released a scene depicting Homer waking from a long coma and acknowledging that all the events since his hospitalization had been a dream, followed immediately by the show's insistence that the scene was a hoax planted by fictional hackers, is one of the most interesting meta-narrative moments in the show's entire history. The show made the scene. It animated it fully. It voiced it. It staged the confirmation of the fan theory with all the production quality of a canonical episode, and then it retracted the confirmation inside the same episode, claiming the scene was not real, was not canonical, was a deception perpetrated by fictional characters and not by the show's actual creative team. This moves the narrative. It does not move the theory, because what the scene's existence proves, separate from its canonical status, is that the writers of the show have engaged with the coma theory seriously enough to produce a full, high-quality, completely realized version of what the theory's confirmation would look like. They know how it would feel. They know what Homer's waking up would mean emotionally. They have sat inside the theory long enough to write and animate and voice its culmination, and then they took it back. They showed you the ending of the story, and then told you the ending was a lie. They confirmed the dream and then insisted the dream was just a dream, which is, note, exactly what Springfield does with every truth it cannot afford to acknowledge. It shows you the truth and then labels the truth as fiction. It lets you see it and then insists that what you saw was not what you saw. It exiles the real Seymour Skinner and installs the fake one and makes it illegal to remember the difference. The show's response to the coma theory is structurally identical to Springfield's response to every inconvenient truth. This might be coincidence. Given everything else about how the show is constructed, it probably is not. Section 15. The Simpsons and the culture it describes. A show and its country, growing together. The Simpsons premiered in December 1989. The Berlin Wall had fallen 5 weeks earlier. The Cold War, which had organized American political life and American cultural anxiety for 40 years, was visibly ending. The country was at the beginning of a decade of relative prosperity and at the end of the particular kind of collective fear that had sustained certain institutional arrangements since the 1940s. The show began making its observations about American life in this specific moment. Its early seasons are products of a country that is prosperous enough to examine itself with some irony, that has enough slack in its system to find the absurdities of daily life funny rather than merely painful, that can look at the nuclear family in the nuclear-powered suburb and find the combination comic rather than threatening. Over the following 36 years, the country changed and the show watched it change and continued making observations about what it was watching. The prosperity of the 1990s gave way to the anxiety of the 2000s, which gave way to the specific kind of ambient institutional distrust that has characterized the years since. The country became in various ways more like Springfield, more concentrated at the top, more managed at the bottom, more organized around the interests of specific powerful actors, more characterized by institutional failures that were visible to everyone and addressed by almost no one. The show did not change to reflect this. The show was already reflecting it. The Springfield that Burns owns, that Quimby mismanages, that the plant contaminates, that the population endures without quite understanding what they are enduring, was constructed in 1989 as satire. By 2025, the satire has become something that requires progressively less exaggeration to seem accurate. This is the prediction phenomenon from the inside. The show did not predict specific events. The show identified the structural features of American life that were already present in 1989 and have become more visible and more dominant since. Burns was always real. The plant was always leaking. The safety inspector was always the way Homer is. The show just wrote it down and gave it names. What Springfield has that America does not. Springfield has something that America, or at least the America the show depicts, consistently lacks. A genuine community, not a good community. Not a functional community or a just community or a community that serves its members' interests effectively. But a community in the sense of a set of people who know each other, who share a history and a geography, who have accumulated enough mutual familiarity that their relationships contain something beyond mere transactional connection. Homer knows Moe and Barney and Lenny and Carl the way people know the specific people they have spent years alongside in the same place. Not chosen relationships, not relationships selected for compatibility or shared values, but the specific kind of connection that long proximity produces, a knowledge of each other's rhythms and habits and failures and recoveries that accumulates without being sought and persists without being maintained, because it has become structural rather than active. This is one of the things the show has been mourning, quietly, across its entire run. The specific texture of life in a place where the people around you are also the people you have always known. Where the bar is the bar you have always gone to, and the man behind it has been there for as long as you have. where the neighborhood has enough history that the houses and the streets contain meanings that cannot be read from the outside, where the community, whatever its failures and its compromises, and its systematic management of inconvenient truths, is a community in the sense that its members actually inhabit it rather than passing through it on the way to somewhere else. This is what the floating timeline preserves, alongside the family and the childhood and the youth it refuses to let pass. It preserves the community as a lived-in place with depth and history and texture. Springfield is not just a setting. It is a place that has been inhabited long enough and carefully enough that it feels like somewhere rather than anywhere. And the show has been making the case for 36 years that this quality of place, whatever its costs, is worth something. That the community organized around Burns's plant, contaminated by Burns's violations, managed by Burns's political investments, is nonetheless a community in a sense that the more mobile, more transactional, less rooted kinds of American life that have replaced it in many actual American communities are not. This is not an apology for Springfield or for what Burns has done to it. It is an observation about what is lost when the conditions that produce this kind of community, the conditions of economic stability and geographic rootedness and long mutual familiarity, are removed or eroded. Springfield is broken in specific ways, but it is also specific in ways that matter. The show's relationship with itself in the late period. By season 25, by season 30, the show has become something that requires a different kind of engagement from its audience than the early seasons required. The early seasons were discovering something, and the audience was discovering it along with them. The late seasons are maintaining something, and the audience is participating in the maintenance. This is not obviously less valuable than discovery. Maintenance has its own dignity and its own demands, but it requires a different orientation from the viewer. The question with the early seasons is, what is this? The question with the late seasons is, why does this persist? What is being preserved? And why is it worth preserving? And what does the preservation cost? The show has been increasingly self-aware about this in the later seasons. Episodes that address the show's own longevity, that reference its cultural history, that acknowledge the specific situation of a story that has outlasted its natural span, are the late period's version of the early period's character revelation episodes. They are the show working out what it is at a point in its existence where it is no longer discovering what it is, but instead deciding what to do with what it has already become. The self-awareness is genuine, and it is sometimes illuminating, and it is sometimes a substitute for the engagement with the characters and the story that would be more valuable if it were available. But even in its less successful late-period experiments, the show is doing something real. It is being honest about its own situation in the same way that it has always been honest about Springfield's situation, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. The show that has been telling you for 36 years that Springfield chooses comfortable lies over inconvenient truths has been willing to acknowledge, about itself, the specific comfortable lie that keeps it running past its natural end. The comfortable lie is that the same thing can continue indefinitely if the people involved want it to continue badly enough. The show knows this is a lie. It has been saying so in the structure of every theory we have examined. The loop runs because we want it to. But loops are not free. They cost something, and the show, in its better late-period moments, has been willing to say so. Final synthesis. What the iceberg contains, the depth of the thing. We went in looking for mysteries. We found something larger. The Springfield Iceberg is not a collection of disconnected curiosities about a long-running television show. It is a single, coherent argument about the specific mechanisms by which ordinary people are kept from understanding the systems that shape their lives, and about what love looks like when those mechanisms have done their work, and about why even people living inside broken systems find things worth preserving in those systems and build their lives around the preservation. Every theory we examined is a different lens on the same subject. The radiation theory names the physical mechanism of the damage. The coma theory names the psychological response to the damage, a refusal to accept loss so complete that it generates an entire alternative universe. The Burns conspiracy names the agent of the damage and the deliberate choices that made it possible. The collective denial theory names the community's response to the damage, the shared agreement to treat the damage as normal, as background, as just the way things are. The prediction theory names the relationship between the show that depicts all of this and the country it depicts it to. Together, they describe a complete world. Not a simple world, not a happy world, but a complete one, in which everything has causes and effects and relationships, in which nothing is accidental, in which the most mundane details, the yellow skin, the four fingers, the three-eyed fish, are the visible evidence of invisible processes that have been operating since before the show began. The Iceberg is the show's second text. The first text is the comedy, the jokes, the characters, the satire, the entertainment. The second text is what the comedy is delivering underneath itself, in the structures and the details and the patterns that accumulate across hundreds of episodes and 36 years into something that is not quite what any individual episode presents. The second text is a love story wrapped in a horror story, wrapped in a political analysis, wrapped in a meditation on time and permanence, and what we most want to keep in a world that takes everything eventually. What you take back to the surface. We have been deep, deeper than the show usually invites you to go. We have followed threads that the comedy surface is specifically designed to prevent you from following. And we have found, at the end of each one, something real. The radiation is real, in the sense that the show has provided enough canonical evidence to make the case irrefutable within its own internal logic. Burns is real. Not just a comedy villain, but a complete portrait of institutional power and its human costs. The conspiracy is real. Not a paranoid fantasy, but a careful accounting of the specific decisions and arrangements that produced Homer's broken psychology and Mona's exile and 3 generations of damaged Simpsons. The dream may be real. The evidence for the coma theory is structural and cumulative and explains things that no other theory explains as cleanly. What you take back to the surface, when you return from the iceberg to the couch and the family and the orange opening theme, is a different way of watching the show. The comedy is still there. The show is still funny. Homer is still going to do something catastrophically wrong and survive it and be forgiven. Bart is still going to pull a prank. Lisa is still going to be right about something important that the town ignores. Maggie is still going to watch everything from the high chair with those enormous eyes and say nothing. But now the yellow skin is not just a design choice. It is evidence. The 4 fingers are not just an animation convention. They are information. The three-eyed fish in the river near the plant is not a Season 2 callback. It is the show's thesis, introduced early, supported continuously, never resolved because Springfield will not resolve it, because resolving it would require the town to look at itself clearly, and the town has made a formal legal agreement not to look at itself clearly. Burns is not just a comedy villain. He is the organizing principle of a community's harm, embodied and made visible, ancient and persistent and glowing faintly after each weekly treatment, the proof that what the plant has done to Springfield, it has also done to the man who owns it, and that the man who owns it is the only one with the resources to manage what it has done. Homer is not just a lovable idiot. He is a man who was broken by specific forces for specific purposes before he was old enough to understand what was happening, who loves his family with a completeness that no amount of breaking could reach, who goes to work every day for the man who destroyed his family without knowing it, and who stumbles home every evening and finds the people he loves on the couch, and who will keep doing this in the eternal present of Springfield's floating timeline for as long as the dream runs. And Maggie is watching, has always been watching, will keep watching until the moment arrives. And then she will speak, or act, or do the things she has been preparing for 36 years of strategic silence, and Springfield will not see it coming, and neither will we, because that is exactly how she designed it. And now you are at the bottom of the iceberg. The yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the three-eyed fish are above you, at the surface where the light is. The Burns conspiracy and the coma dream and the radiation mutation and the collective denial are somewhere in the middle depths. Down here, at the very bottom, there is just a family on a couch, a man who loves his family, a woman who holds everything together, a boy who is 10 and always will be, a girl who is right about everything and keeps going anyway, a baby who is watching, and the house on Evergreen Terrace, standing in a town that cannot be found on any map, in a loop that runs because we built it and run because we choose to press play. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. And it is also, in ways that the iceberg cannot fully account for and the theories cannot fully explain, a form of love. Good night, Springfield. Good night. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. Drop a comment with the detail that stayed with you longest. If you want more of this, subscribe, and if you fell asleep somewhere in the middle, that is exactly what this was for. The complete Burns mythology, a century of Springfield, from Gilded Age to Nuclear Age. There is a through line in the Burns backstory that the show has assembled piece by piece across its run, a biographical arc that begins well before the first episode and extends so far back into American history that it becomes genuinely difficult to reconcile with any normal account of individual human possibility. Burns attended Yale. He served in World War II, though the show depicts his service in terms that suggest his contributions to the Allied cause were morally ambiguous at best. He knew Howard Hughes personally. He has referenced the Gilded Age as lived experience rather than as history. He has described the turn of the 20th century as a period he navigated as an adult, with opinions about events from that era delivered with the specificity of personal memory rather than the generality of historical knowledge. If Burns graduated from Yale at a conventional age, he was born no later than the early 1880s and possibly significantly earlier. If his earliest personal memories reach back into the mid-19th century, as some canonical episodes suggest, the number is earlier still. The show is not consistent about this, because the show has never been consistent about anything regarding Burns's age, and the inconsistency is probably deliberate. Pinning Burns to a specific birth year would create too many obvious logical problems across the show's different canonical periods. What the show is consistent about is the quality of Burns's relationship with the past. He treats American history as his personal history. He does not reference historical events as things he read about or learned about. He references them as things that happened to him, around him, as the background of a life he was living. The Gilded Age plutocracy that he embodies is not something he inherited as an abstraction. It is something he experienced and participated in, and has been extending ever since. This places Burns in a specific lineage. The men who built America's industrial infrastructure in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, whose wealth was extracted from labor and resources in conditions that bear no resemblance to the regulatory environment that followed, and whose fortunes created the financial dynasties that have organized significant portions of American economic and political life since. Burns is not one of their descendants. He is, the show implies, one of them, directly. Personally. The original plutocrat, still alive, still operating, having outlasted every competitor and every reform movement and every attempt at accountability through the combination of his medical protocol and his comprehensive management of the institutions that would otherwise have constrained him, a man who was present at the creation of the system he continues to operate, is a man who knows the system from the inside in a way that no subsequent player can match. Burns built the system. He understands its mechanisms because he designed them. He knows which regulatory frameworks were built around specific gaps he left, which political relationships were constructed around specific needs he had, which institutional arrangements were established to serve which purposes. He has been there since the beginning. He is the beginning, the Burns family dynasty, and what it implies. The show has depicted the Burns family tree as one of the oldest and most consistently powerful lineages in American history, predating the Industrial Revolution in its foundations, and extending continuously through every subsequent period of economic transformation. This is a specific and significant claim. A fortune that predates the Industrial Revolution and has been maintained across every subsequent upheaval, every depression and every war, and every regulatory reform and every technological change that has reshaped the American economy, is a fortune that was not maintained by accident. It was maintained through active management of the political and legal and regulatory environment, through the kind of sustained institutional influence that money of sufficient scale can purchase and compound across generations. Burns did not inherit a fortune and preserve it passively. Burns inherited a fortune and continued doing what the fortune was built from doing, identifying the mechanisms by which power concentrates and resources flow, positioning himself within those mechanisms, and ensuring that the flow continues in his direction regardless of changes in the surrounding environment. The nuclear plant is the current expression of this. Before the nuclear plant, there were other industrial operations, other resource extraction enterprises, other mechanisms of value capture that the Burns family deployed across different periods of American economic history. The plant is what the current moment offers to someone with Burns's resources and Burns's purposes. When the current moment ends, the family, or in this case the man, will find the next mechanism. Burns has been finding the next mechanism for longer than most institutions have been in existence. This is why Springfield cannot simply get rid of the plant. The plant is not the thing Burns is. It is the current expression of the thing Burns is. Remove the plant, and Burns finds another mechanism. The power is not in the facility. The power is in the man who has been maintaining it for a century and who will outlast any specific arrangement if the arrangement stops serving his purposes. Burns and the future he is building. The show has never addressed what Burns wants for the long term. His weekly treatments keep him alive for 7 more days. His medical infrastructure ensures the treatments keep coming. His wealth funds the infrastructure. His plant generates the wealth. The loop is closed and it runs, and Burns runs inside it, surviving 1 week at a time, maintaining the arrangement that keeps him alive and the town that keeps the arrangement running. But the loop has no future built into it. It is maintenance, not construction. Burns is not building something new. He is preserving something old. Himself, his wealth, his empire, the specific configuration of arrangements that has served his purposes since before anyone in Springfield was born. The question the show occasionally approaches and always retreats from is what happens when the maintenance fails. Not if it fails, not because of any moral logic according to which Burns eventually faces justice, but simply because maintenance protocols can fail. Smithers could die. The medical infrastructure could be disrupted. The treatments could become unavailable. Burns's body, already running on borrowed time measured in 7-day increments, could reach a state where the treatments can no longer maintain the equilibrium the doctor described. When that happens, Springfield will face a version of the problem that the economists call the successor problem. What comes after the organizing principle of your community's existence? For Springfield, this is not an abstract institutional question. It is the question of what happens to a town that was built around one man, by one man, for one man's purposes, when that man is gone. The answer the show implies but never states is that Springfield does not have an answer to this question. It has never needed one because Burns has never died. The institutions of Springfield were not built to function without Burns. They were built to function with Burns, in his service, according to his preferences and his needs. The day that changes, Springfield will have to figure out, for the first time, what it actually is when it is not organized around the man who has organized it for over a century. This might be the darkest implication of the Burns mythology, not what he has done, but what comes after what he has done. The void he will eventually leave in a community that has no practice being anything other than his. The conspiracy of language. How Springfield talks about itself. The vocabulary of denial. There is a specific vocabulary that Springfield uses when it confronts things it does not want to confront, and the show has been precise about this vocabulary across its entire run. When something catastrophic happens, when the town is destroyed or sealed under a dome, or experiences a near-nuclear event, or discovers that its principal has been an imposter for 20 years, the language that Springfield's residents use to process this is not the language of alarm, or investigation, or accountability. It is the language of normalization. The language of, well, these things happen, and I guess that's just how it is, and there's nothing to be done about it. And, most commonly, simply the language of silence, the subject changed, the previous event not referenced in the next episode as though it had no more weight than a weather event. This vocabulary is not cynical. It is not performative. The people using it believe it. The normalization is genuine because the cognitive resources that would allow for sustained critical analysis of the event have been reduced to the point where genuine normalization is the available response. It is not that Springfield's residents are choosing not to investigate. They lack the capacity for the sustained investigative engagement that would be required, not in the sense of physical incapacity, but in the neurological sense of the specific kind of analytical stamina that has been gradually eroded by decades of contaminated water and underfunded education and the comprehensive management of their civic environment. Homer's response to learning that his wife briefly worked at the nuclear plant, potentially exposing herself to the same conditions that have shaped his own biology, is a good example. The response is not an investigation or an alarm. The response is a small emotional moment, a brief recognition, and then the subject moves on. The cognitive work that would convert that recognition into sustained analysis and eventual action is not available. The recognition dissolves before it can generate anything beyond itself. This is the contamination working at the level of individual cognition. Not preventing recognition, but preventing the conversion of recognition into action, the specific step that requires the kind of sustained analytical engagement that the contamination has specifically reduced. What Lisa's vocabulary reveals. Lisa is the exception. Lisa's vocabulary, when she engages with Springfield's problems, is consistently the vocabulary of cause and effect, of systemic analysis, of the kind of investigative language that the rest of the population does not use. She traces problems to their sources. She connects present conditions to past decisions. She articulates the relationship between the plant's operations and the community's health, between Burns's wealth and the school's poverty, between institutional arrangements and the outcomes those arrangements produce. She speaks about Springfield in the language that the rest of Springfield cannot use about itself. This is why she is isolated. Not because she is wrong, not because her intelligence is simply greater than those around her, but because the specific kind of thinking she does, the systemic, causal, structural analysis that she applies to Springfield's situation, is the specific kind of thinking that the contamination has made unavailable to Springfield's population at large. She can do it because something about her specific biology, perhaps the mutation that also produced her extraordinary intelligence, has protected or even enhanced the neurological capacity for this kind of thinking. The rest of Springfield cannot do it, not because they are less intelligent in some general sense, but because the specific cognitive function required has been specifically reduced. Lisa is the town's diagnostic instrument. She identifies the problems with the precision that a properly functioning critical intelligence can achieve. She articulates them in language that, if the people around her had the cognitive infrastructure to receive it, would be the beginning of organized response. And the people around her receive it sympathetically, even agree with it in the moment, and then do nothing, not because they are indifferent, but because the conversion from recognition to action requires the analytical stamina that is not there. This is the tragic loop of Lisa's existence in Springfield. She is right about everything. She says the right things in the right language, to the right people, at the right moments. And it changes nothing, not because nobody listens, but because listening is not the limiting step. The limiting step is what comes after listening, the sustained engagement with an uncomfortable truth that would be required to act on it, and that sustained engagement is exactly what the contamination has made most difficult. The language Burns uses. Burns's vocabulary, when he speaks about Springfield and its residents, is characteristically specific. He does not speak of his employees with contempt, exactly. He speaks of them with the mild, slightly puzzled tolerance that one extends to things that are useful but not quite comprehensible. He consistently fails to remember Homer's name. This has been a running element of their relationship across the entire show, and it is played primarily for comedy, the indignity of the man who cannot be remembered by his own employer despite decades of work. But the failure to remember Homer's name is not absent-mindedness. Burns remembers everything that is useful to him. He remembers the details of contracts. He remembers financial arrangements. He remembers political debts. He remembers faces and names when those faces and names are attached to power or resources. He does not remember Homer's name because Homer's name is not information Burns needs. Homer is a function in a system, not a person with a name. He fills the role of the safety inspector who does not perform the safety inspector's function, and that is the entirety of what Burns needs him to be. The name attached to the function is irrelevant. Burns interacts with the function. He has never needed to interact with the person. This is the vocabulary of the system describing itself. When the system speaks about the people inside it, it speaks in functional terms, in terms of role and utility, because that is how the system processes the people inside it. Homer is the safety inspector who ensures the violations continue. Smithers is the assistant who manages the treatments. Springfield is the workforce and the customer base. The language is not cruel. It is simply precise about what the system values, which is not the people, but the functions the people fill. Burns is not a monster. He is the most honest speaker in Springfield because his language describes the world accurately from the perspective of the system that he embodies. From the system's perspective, Homer is a function. From the system's perspective, Springfield is a resource. From the system's perspective, what matters is that the loop keeps running, and the treatments keep coming, and the lights stay on, and the bills get paid. Everything else is detail. The secondary character's hidden depths. A closer look. Barney Gumble, the man who might have been. Barney Gumble is Homer's oldest friend. He has been at Moe's Tavern for the entirety of the show's run. He is, by any visible measure, one of Springfield's most comprehensively damaged residents, his life organized around alcohol to a degree that the show has always depicted with more honesty than its comedy register might suggest was necessary. There is a detail about Barney that the show introduces in one episode and does not develop extensively, but that reframes everything the viewer has understood about him. Barney was, before the events of the show, a genuinely exceptional student. Academic and intellectual promise. The kind of trajectory that, in a different set of circumstances, might have led somewhere very different from a stool at Moe's bar. The specific event that began his trajectory toward where he ended up was a beer, shared with Homer at a specific moment in their shared history, before a critical examination that Barney had worked hard to prepare for. One beer, the beginning of a long relationship with alcohol that has organized the rest of his life. The show presents this as backstory comedy, a brief flashback that illuminates the character with a single detail. But the detail is genuinely tragic if you sit with it. Barney is not someone who is always going to end up on that stool. He had a different possible life. The circumstances of his trajectory, the specific moment, and the specific friendship that redirected it were particular rather than inevitable. Springfield has several of these people. Characters whose present condition does not reflect their potential, and whose path from potential to present is traceable to specific events and specific contexts. Homer, Barney, Apu. Groundskeeper Willie. The show builds Springfield's background population from people like this, people for whom the gap between what they might have been and what they are is visible to the attentive viewer, even when it is not visible to the characters themselves. This is part of what gives Springfield its specific texture as a place. It is not populated by people who were always going to be exactly where they are. It is populated by people whose paths were altered by circumstances, by choices, by the specific properties of the environment they were born into and grew up inside. The contaminated water and the underfunded school and the economic dependency on a single employer whose interests are not aligned with the community's well-being. These are not just satirical background details. They are the specific conditions that produce the specific people on the specific stools at Moe's bar. Lionel Hutz and the law in Springfield. Lionel Hutz is Springfield's most reliably available attorney. He operates from a business address that suggests his practice has not achieved the level of institutional stability that the provision of legal services to an entire community would ideally require. His legal knowledge is comprehensive in its confidence and variable in its accuracy. He will take any case and pursue it with an enthusiasm that compensates for whatever he lacks in formal legal training. He is like Dr. Nick in the medical context, the show's portrait of professional services provided without adequate professional foundation. And like Dr. Nick, he is funny because the incompetence is presented as theatrical rather than genuinely harmful. The comedy requires that the consequences remain manageable, that the worst outcomes produced by his legal malpractice are embarrassment or minor financial loss rather than the catastrophic outcomes that actual legal malpractice can produce. But Hutz exists in the same Springfield as the power plant and the contaminated water and the Billy deal between Burns and Grandpa. In a community with functional legal infrastructure, the Burns conspiracy would face legal exposure. The dumping of radioactive waste into water bodies is a serious federal environmental crime. The 342 safety violations are not all misdemeanors. The suppression of a criminal investigation in a shooting case has legal implications. The biological weapons laboratory's operation within a residential area, however long ago, is not without legal consequence. Springfield's legal infrastructure is Lionel Hutz. The legal resource available to Springfield's residents for the challenges that would most require legal representation, challenges to institutional power, environmental litigation, public health accountability, is a man whose primary office appears to be a phone booth. This is not incidental. The quality of legal representation available to a community is part of the infrastructure that determines whether institutional power can be held accountable. When the legal infrastructure is Lionel Hutz, institutional power operates without that accountability. Burns's legal exposure has never resulted in legal consequence, not because the show is unwilling to address it, but because the community that would need to generate and sustain that legal challenge lacks the resources to do so. The contaminated water has reduced the cognitive stamina required for sustained legal engagement. The underfunded school has reduced the legal literacy that would allow residents to understand their options. The economic dependency on Burns's plant has made the economic risk of challenging him prohibitive for most of the community. And the legal representation available when someone does decide to challenge is Lionel Hutz. The system protects itself at every layer. The legal layer is Hutz. Professor Frink, the intelligence the system does not use. Professor Frink is Springfield's scientist. He has appeared in many episodes over the course of the show's run, consistently demonstrating genuine scientific capability in contexts that the show treats as comedy. He invents things. He predicts things. He identifies problems with Springfield's technical infrastructure with accurate frequency. His scientific instincts are sound even when his personal execution is chaotic. He is also, within Springfield's social structure, a figure of mild mockery whose expertise is sought occasionally and ignored systematically. The town calls on him when it needs a specific technical capability, and then disregards both him and the implications of what he finds as soon as the immediate need is addressed. Frink is, among other things, the show's portrait of what happens to genuine scientific intelligence in a community that does not have the institutional structure to make productive use of it. He is not absent from Springfield. He is present and functional and capable. But the connection between his capability and meaningful application in the community is broken, not because anyone specifically blocks it, but because the community has not built the institutions that would allow the connection to function. A community that took Frink's findings seriously would have, by season 3 at the latest, identified the specific environmental consequences of the nuclear plant's operations, constructed a legal and regulatory case for remediation, and initiated a process of accountability that would have significantly altered Springfield's subsequent history. Frink has the knowledge. The community has never had the infrastructure to use it. This is the specific way that inadequate civic infrastructure manifests in technical fields, not through the absence of expertise, but through the absence of the systems that would translate expertise into action. The expertise is there. The institutional connective tissue between expertise and outcome is what is missing. Burns's management of Springfield's civic infrastructure has specifically prevented that connective tissue from developing. Not through direct suppression of science, not through the burning of Frink's research, but through the systematic underfunding of the institutions that would support the translation of scientific knowledge into civic action. The school, the regulatory bodies, the legal framework, the civic organizations that would host the conversation between Frink's findings and the community's response. The knowledge exists. The system for using it does not. This is a more subtle and more durable form of control than censorship. The deepest layer, love as physics. What survives everything? We have followed the iceberg all the way down. We have examined the contamination and the conspiracy and the dream and the denial and the prediction machine and the locked timeline. We have traced 3 generations of damage through the Simpson family and followed Burns's century of managed survival and sat with Maggie's strategic silence and watched Lisa fight the same fight in every episode. At the very bottom, past all the theories and all the evidence and all the careful analysis of structure and mechanism, there is something that none of the theories can fully account for and none of the evidence can explain away. The family is still on the couch. After everything that has been done to them, after the contamination and the crayon and the conspiracy and the exile of Mona and the deal that Grandpa made and the 30 years of being the employee of the man who destroyed his family without knowing it, Homer Simpson comes home. He finds his way back. In every episode, through every catastrophe, by every available route, Homer comes home to the couch, and the family is there, and the love is there, and none of what has been done to them has reached that. This is not a claim that the harm doesn't matter. The harm matters. It is documented across the entire run of the show with a precision and a consistency that the comedy surface does not diminish. The contamination is real. The conspiracy is real. The damage is real and it is ongoing and it has specific consequences in the lives of specific people. But the love is also real. And the specific love that Homer has for Marge and for his children, the love that Marge has for the family she has spent 36 years holding together, the love that is visible in the specific way the show keeps returning its characters to each other at the end of every episode. This love is not reducible to any of the mechanisms of harm that surround it. This is the show's deepest argument. Not that the harm doesn't matter, not that love conquers everything, which is a different and simpler claim, but that love persists in conditions specifically designed to prevent it, that it endures in a biology altered by contamination and in a psychology shaped by deliberate manipulation, and in a family whose history has been managed by external forces with no interest in the family's well-being. The love persists anyway, not triumphantly, not without cost, not without being tested in every episode and surviving by narrower margins in some episodes than others, but persisting, returning, finding its way back to the couch by the time the credits roll. This is what the iceberg contains at its deepest point. Not the conspiracy or the contamination or the coma. The couch, the family, the specific gravity of love in a system that has been working against it for as long as the show has been running and that has not managed to extinguish it yet. Why Homer goes home. Homer should not be able to navigate home. The plant and the water and the crayon in the 30-year fog have left him with cognitive resources that are barely adequate for the tasks of daily life. He cannot form the kinds of long-term cause and effect chains that would allow him to understand his own situation. He cannot sustain the kind of analytical engagement that would allow him to challenge the systems that shape his life. He cannot remember, between episodes, the consequences of the previous episode's mistakes, at least not in the way that sustained moral learning would require. But he goes home. Every episode, by whatever route the story required him to take, Homer finds the house on Evergreen Terrace and the couch and the family. The navigation is not cognitive. It is not the product of sustained analytical engagement with the relationship between his location and the people he loves. It is something else, something that operates below the level of cognition, below the level of the fog, below the level of whatever the contamination and the crayon have done to his processing capacity. Call it love, because that is what the show calls it. The word is imprecise and the phenomenon it names is real. Homer goes home because the home is where the thing that organizes him lives. He does not think his way home. He is drawn home. The way things that belong together are drawn together, not by logic but by something that precedes logic. The contamination reduced his intelligence. It did not reduce this. Burns engineered his broken psychology. The engineering did not reach this. 30 years of working for the man who exiled his mother did not produce in Homer the specific kind of cynicism or despair or numbed acceptance that would make the going home feel like defeat rather than return. Homer goes home because he loves his family more than the system managed to damage him. This is the show's one unambiguous claim, the claim it has been making since the first episode and has never walked back. Whatever else is true about Homer Simpson, this is true. The love is there. The love persists. The love goes home. Maggie and the future of Springfield. We return one final time to Maggie. Every theory about Springfield's future, every projection of what happens next, what happens when Burns eventually dies, or when the coma eventually ends, or when the contamination eventually produces consequences too severe to absorb, or when the collective denial finally breaks under the weight of its own. Accumulation, every projection runs through Maggie. Because Maggie is the only member of the Simpson family who has not been broken by what Springfield has done to the family. Homer was broken before he was old enough to understand it. Marge has been managing the cost of staying unbroken for decades, and the management has its own costs. Lisa fights the breakage every episode, and the fight itself is a form of damage. Bart disrupts the system that has damaged the family but does not have the tools to dismantle it. Maggie has not been broken. The contamination that diminished Homer appears to have amplified her. The strategic position she has chosen, the deliberate invisibility of the baby who nobody suspects, has protected her from the psychological management that shapes the rest of the family. She has watched everything. She has stored everything. She is the family's unmolested memory, its uncompromised intelligence, its unbroken capacity for the kind of sustained analytical engagement that the rest of Springfield has been specifically prevented from exercising. She has not acted yet. 36 years and she has not acted. The daycare was practice. The shooting was a test. The silence has been the preparation for something that the show has not yet depicted, something that Maggie has been preparing for since the day she was born, something that the system did not account for when it built the arrangements that have shaped the family's life. When Maggie acts, if the show ever allows her to act in the way her accumulated preparation suggests she is capable of, what happens in Springfield will not be a small thing. It will not be an episode where a crisis is averted and everything returns to baseline. If Maggie is what the evidence suggests she is, what she does with 3.5 decades of watching and storing and preparing will be sufficient to the system it is directed toward. Springfield will not see it coming. Nobody will see it coming, because that is exactly how Maggie designed it. And until that moment, the loop runs. The dream continues. The radiation is in the water. Burns is alive. The plant is leaking. Homer is in Sector 7G. And on Evergreen Terrace, in the house that stands in the town that cannot be found on any map, a family is on a couch, and the love that persists in everything it has been subjected to is still there, still intact, still drawing Homer home at the end of every episode, still organizing the dream that refuses to stop. Good night, Springfield. We'll be back next week. Thank you for spending this time with the iceberg. Drop a comment with the theory that stayed with you, or the detail you'll never unsee now that you've seen it. And if you want more of this, subscribe. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. The predictions in full detail. The complete list and what it actually means. The phenomenon of the Simpsons predictions deserves more space than we gave it earlier. The Trump prediction is the most famous, but the list contains entries that are, in certain ways, more surprising. In 1994, a Simpsons episode depicted autocorrect-style technology, making absurd substitutions in text, presenting what a user intended to write and what the device actually produced as two entirely different things. Autocorrect, in the specific form the episode depicted, did not become a daily frustration for hundreds of millions of people until the widespread adoption of smartphones in the late 2000s and early 2010s. The specific comedy of the autocorrect failure, the gap between intention and output, between what you meant and what the machine produced, is something the show found funny in 1994 and America found frustrating in 2012. The joke preceded the experience by nearly 2 decades. The smartwatch episode from 1995 depicts a wrist-mounted device with a screen and communication capabilities that resembles the Apple Watch closely enough that Apple Watch owners, when the image circulated, found the resemblance uncanny. The episode did not know what an Apple Watch would look like. It knew that computing would get smaller and more personal and would eventually reach the wrist, because this was a visible trajectory in 1995, and it depicted that trajectory's endpoint. The endpoint arrived in 2015, 20 years later, looking broadly like what the show had drawn. The Higgs boson equation is the strangest case and worth detailed treatment. In a 1998 episode, a mathematician working a problem on a chalkboard has, in the background of a scene that is not about the mathematics, an equation that a physicist named Simon Singh later identified as containing a value that predicts the mass of the Higgs boson particle. Singh wrote about this after the particle's mass was confirmed by the Large Hadron Collider experiments in 2012. The equation was in the background of a Simpsons episode 14 years earlier. The Simpsons writing staff in 1998 included David X. Cohen, who holds a master's degree in computer science from UC Berkeley, and other writers with strong scientific backgrounds. Cohen has stated that he genuinely tried to include accurate mathematics in the show whenever possible. This is not a mystical prediction. It is what you get when mathematically sophisticated writers depict a mathematician working a real problem and take the mathematics seriously enough to actually write a real equation. The COVID parallel from the 1993 flu outbreak episode is the one that gains the most traction in non-fan circles when it circulates, because the broad outlines are so recognizable. A respiratory illness originating in Asia, spreading internationally, producing institutional breakdown and panic buying, and a community-wide search for a cure. The details that differ, which are many, are never discussed in the viral versions of the comparison. The details that align, which are fewer but more vivid, are the ones that circulate. This is the confirmation bias engine at work at its most visible. The Disney-Fox prediction from 1998 is perhaps the most structurally interesting of all the widely cited examples. In 1998, media consolidation was already a highly visible trend. Major corporate acquisitions in media had been occurring for years. The direction of travel was clear to anyone paying attention to the industry. The show depicted Fox being swallowed by a larger corporation because that was the direction the industry was traveling, and satire depicts directions the industry is traveling. When Disney bought Fox in 2019, the joke's specific naming of the company that would eventually be acquired made the connection feel prophetic. But the show was not naming Fox specifically because it knew about the 2019 transaction. The show was naming Fox because Fox was its own network, and satirizing the possibility of being absorbed by a larger corporate entity is a natural thing for a show on a broadcast network to do in an era of consolidating media. The mechanism behind the hits. What produces the cases that seem genuinely surprising, rather than simply the product of volume and confirmation bias? The Simpsons writing staff has always included people with specific technical knowledge in specific domains: mathematics, computer science, physics, political theory, economics. These are not writers who observe culture from a generalist perspective. They are people who understand specific technical fields well enough to see where those fields are going based on the internal logic of the field rather than external observation of trends. The Higgs boson equation exists because a writer who understood physics well enough to write a real equation wrote one that, by the logic of the physics, pointed in a specific direction. The smartwatch exists because a writer who understood computing understood the direction that processing power and miniaturization were moving and followed that direction to the wrist. The autocorrect failure exists because a writer who understood human-computer interaction understood the gap between what natural language processing could do and what users would expect it to do, and depicted that gap before the technology that would expose it was widely deployed. This is what makes the show's predictions different from random guessing. It is not prophecy, and it is not time travel, and it is not supernatural foreknowledge. It is a specific kind of domain expertise being applied to trajectory projection. Writers who know their fields look at where the fields are going and depict the destination before it arrives. Sometimes the destination arrives in a form that aligns closely enough with the depiction that the alignment looks uncanny. The alignment is not uncanny. It is the natural product of accurate trajectory projection by people with sufficient domain expertise to project accurately. The cases that cannot be fully explained by this mechanism, the escalator, the specific details of the Roy Horn attack, the equation's specific numerical value, these are either remarkable coincidences of a kind that 36 years of high-volume satirical production will inevitably produce a few of, or they are evidence that the domain expertise occasionally extends into domains where the writers were working closer to the edge of what could be projected than even they realized. Either reading is more interesting than prophecy. Genuine domain expertise applied to genuine trajectory projection, occasionally reaching beyond the projectable into something closer to foresight, is a more remarkable human achievement than having accidentally guessed the future. The cultural influence loop completed. There is one more thing to say about the prediction phenomenon that the available analyses have not fully addressed. The Simpsons has been consumed, for 36 years, by the people who run things, not just ordinary viewers. The writers and directors and executives and politicians and business people and technologists who have been watching the show since childhood, who quote it in meetings, who reference it in conversations, who have absorbed its specific vocabulary for describing the absurdities of American life as part of their own vocabulary. When these people make decisions, when they choose the directions in which to take their industries or their political projects or their technological developments, they are making those choices inside a cultural environment that includes The Simpsons as one of its organizing elements. The show has been part of the ambient cultural context of decision-making in American public life for 36 years. It is not impossible that some of the show's apparent predictions exist because the people who made the decisions that produced the predicted outcomes had, at some level, absorbed the show's depictions of those outcomes as part of their own sense of what was possible or desirable or inevitable. The Trump escalator descent. It is not impossible that the specific staging of it was influenced, at some remove, by the cultural image that the 2000 Simpsons episode had deposited in the American cultural imagination. The Disney-Fox acquisition. It is not impossible that some of the cultural readiness for media consolidation at that scale was prepared, in part, by decades of the show treating such consolidation as an obvious satirical target. The show does not predict the future. The show participates in constructing the cultural imagination that the future is built from. This is a more interesting and more verifiable claim than prophecy, and it is the claim that the prediction phenomenon ultimately supports. Final section. The show as it will be remembered. What 36 years produced? When The Simpsons ends, and it will end, some version of a consensus will form around what the show was. The consensus will probably center on the early seasons and their particular quality, the combination of intelligence and heart and speed and specific comic sensibility that the best of those episodes represent. The later seasons will be addressed as a decline from that peak, which is the standard framing and is not entirely wrong. But the framing misses what the full run produced, which is not available in any individual season or any individual episode. It is available only in the accumulation, in the weight of 36 years of attention to the same characters and the same community, in the depth of a world built episode by episode across decades, until it became something that cannot be entered at any single point, because no single point contains enough of what the whole contains. The Springfield that exists in the final season of the show is not the Springfield of the first season. It is richer, more layered, more internally complex, haunted by its own history in ways that the first season's Springfield was not and could not have been. The yellow skin means more in season 35 than it meant in season 1, not because the show has explained it more thoroughly, it has not, but because 34 additional seasons of evidence have accumulated around it, turning a design choice into something that participates in a much larger argument than any individual episode was making. The show's full run is its actual achievement, not any individual season or period within it. The early seasons are the foundation. The later seasons are what you build on the foundation once the foundation has had time to settle and the structure above it has had time to accumulate. Neither is sufficient without the other. The architecture requires both. Springfield as the show's real main character. Critics who discuss The Simpsons typically discuss Homer or the Simpson family as the show's protagonist. This is accurate at the level of narrative focus. But the show's real main character is Springfield. Homer is the protagonist. Springfield is the subject. Everything that happens to Homer, everything that happens to the family, exists within and in relationship to Springfield. And Springfield has been the constant across every change the show has undergone. Characters come and go. Recurring figures are developed and then retired. Voice actors change. The writing room changes. Animation styles evolve. The cultural references update. Springfield remains. Springfield is the most completely realized fictional community in the history of American television. No other show has built a setting with this much internal consistency, this much accumulated detail, this much specific texture and history and mythology and unresolved tension. The show has been building Springfield continuously for 36 years, and the result is a place that feels, to the people who have been watching long enough, as real as actual places, as specific, as inhabited, as full of the particular history that actual places accumulate through long use. The theories we have explored are the show's invitation to take Springfield seriously as a place. Not as a setting, not as a background for stories, but as an actual community with actual mechanisms and actual history and actual consequences for the people who live in it. The radiation and the conspiracy and the collective denial and the coma dream are not just theories about a television show. They are the attentive viewer's engagement with a place that has been built carefully enough and consistently enough across enough time to support that level of engagement. Springfield deserved the attention. The show built it to deserve the attention. And the theories, whatever their truth value as accounts of what the show's creators intended, are evidence that viewers have been paying the kind of attention that the show was asking for. What the iceberg is. The iceberg is not a set of answers. It is a set of questions that the show has been asking across 36 years, embedded in its structure and its details and its accumulated patterns, rather than in its explicit narrative content. Why are these people yellow? Why do they have 4 fingers? Why does the fish have 3 eyes? Why does nobody age? Why does Homer survive everything? Why can Burns not die? Why does nobody in Springfield connect the 3-eyed fish to the people drinking the water it swam in? Why does Homer continue to work for the man who destroyed his family? Why did the town vote to keep the lie? Why does Maggie not speak? These are the questions the show has been embedding in its surface for 36 years. The iceberg is the accumulation of those questions and the best available attempts to answer them. The answers are incomplete. They are always incomplete. Springfield is designed to resist complete answers, to generate more questions than it resolves, to leave the attentive viewer with the specific feeling of a place that contains more than has been shown. This is the show's greatest achievement. Not the comedy, though the comedy is remarkable. Not the satire, though the satire is precise. The greatest achievement is the world, Springfield, built carefully enough across enough time that it can support not just the stories told within it, but the theories constructed around it, the questions that its consistency invites, the sense that there is more to find there if you look. There is always more to find there. That is the whole point. And now you have been there. Take what you found back with you. And when you press play next time, and the couch gag runs, and the family converges from their different directions, notice the yellow skin. Notice the 4 fingers. Notice Maggie in Marge's arms, watching everything. The radiation is in the water. Burns is alive. The dream is running. The mystery is open. And Springfield is exactly as you left it. It always will be. That is the iceberg. Thank you for going all the way down. Comment below with what you're thinking about now that you didn't think about before. Subscribe if you want to go deeper somewhere else. And wherever you are, whatever time it is, we hope you sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. The Final Descent. Everything we haven't said. On continuity and what it costs to maintain it. The Simpsons has a specific relationship with its own continuity that is different from every other long-running show in television history, and the difference matters in ways that the show's critics have identified without fully articulating. Most long-running shows exist in a relationship with their continuity that is essentially protective. The writers know the canon. They try not to contradict it. They build new story on top of old story, and when contradictions emerge, they are treated as mistakes to be quietly avoided in future. The continuity is a resource to be maintained. The Simpsons treats its continuity as a resource to be exploited and then abandoned. The show will introduce a piece of backstory, use it for the specific episode that needs it, and then either not reference it again or contradict it in a future episode without acknowledgement. Homer's mother was dead, and then she was not dead, and then she died again. Homer and Marge's courtship has been set in 4 different decades. Springfield has been in different states and different episodes without any explicit awareness that the geography is contradicting itself. This has always been the show's most criticized formal feature. The continuity failures feel, to careful viewers, like a lack of care, like the writers not taking the world they built seriously enough to maintain it. The criticism is not unreasonable. Careful continuity is a form of respect for the audience's investment. But the floating continuity is also, read differently, one of the show's most honest structural features. It reflects the specific kind of memory that the show depicts its characters as having, incomplete, subject to revision, shaped more by what the present requires than by what the past recorded. Homer cannot maintain consistent memories across episodes because something has damaged the cognitive infrastructure that sustained memory requires. Springfield cannot maintain consistent geography because Springfield is organized around not knowing where it is. The show's continuity failures are not laziness. They are the form of the content. A show about a community that systematically forgets its own history has, appropriately, a relationship with its own history that is similarly casual. The writers are not failing to maintain the canon. They are embodying, in their relationship with the canon, the same quality that defines Springfield's relationship with its own past. This does not make every continuity error intentional or meaningful. Some are simply mistakes. But the pattern of the errors, the specific things the show forgets, and the specific things it retains, is consistent enough to suggest that the forgetting is at least partly purposeful. What the music tells you. The Simpsons theme, written by Danny Elfman, is one of the most recognizable pieces of television music ever composed. It is the opening statement of the show, heard in every episode for 36 years, and it does something specific. It begins in a particular emotional register. There is something in the theme that is simultaneously playful and slightly melancholy, energetic and slightly anxious, the musical equivalent of someone doing something with great enthusiasm who knows, somewhere beneath the enthusiasm, that what they are doing will not last. The theme is the musical portrait of the show's central tension, the energy of the family's life, and the awareness, buried beneath the surface of every episode, that the life they are living is maintained by mechanisms they cannot see and is more fragile than the comedy surface suggests. The couch gag changes every episode. The theme does not. The theme is the constant, the thing that situates every new episode within the 36-year structure that precedes it. Hearing the theme is the experience of arriving back in a place you know well. The specific quality of that arrival, the mixture of comfort and something slightly harder to name, is partly the theme's musical character and partly the accumulated weight of every previous time you have heard it. The music tells you what the show is before a single word of dialogue is spoken. It tells you that what you are about to watch is funny and loving and slightly sad and aware of its own fragility in ways that the comedy surface does not always acknowledge. It tells you that the family on the couch is worth loving and that loving them costs something. It tells you that the show knows what it is and has always known what it is. The music has been telling you this for 36 years. Most viewers have heard it enough times that they no longer consciously process it. It has become part of the background, like Springfield's geography, like the yellow skin, like the four fingers. Present always, noticed rarely, meaning something continuous that only becomes visible when you stop long enough to look. On Falling Asleep to Springfield, there is something specific about this show at this length of run that makes it well suited to the particular mode of watching that this video was designed for. The Simpsons is familiar enough, after 36 years, that it can be watched with only partial attention without losing the thread. The comedy is dense enough that fully engaged watching is rewarding. The emotional depth is sufficient that the moments of genuine feeling land even through partial consciousness. The world is complete enough that revisiting it, arriving in a familiar place after some time away, produces the specific comfort of return. This is why the show works as late-night viewing, as background to other activities, as something you put on when you want to be somewhere specific, but not required to concentrate fully on being there. Springfield requires the level of attention you have available, and returns something proportional to that attention. More attention produces more of the deeper structures. Less attention produces the comfortable comedy surface. Either is sufficient. The show is designed to work at multiple levels of engagement simultaneously. Falling Asleep to Springfield is a specific experience that the show's entire design supports. The familiar voices, the familiar music, the familiar rhythms of the comedy, and the specific comfort of knowing that whatever happens this episode, whatever catastrophe the family navigates, they will be on the couch by the end, and Maggie will be in Marge's arms, and Homer will have found his way home. The dream that refuses to end, the family preserved in amber, the eternal present of Evergreen Terrace, available at any time to anyone who presses play. This is what we built in 1989 and have been maintaining ever since. This is what the iceberg contains at its deepest point, not the conspiracy or the contamination or the mystery, but the specific comfort of a place that always exists and always stays the same and always has the same people in it doing the same things for as long as we need them to. Good night, Springfield. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you for being here for all of it. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. If there's a corner of the iceberg we didn't reach that you want to go to, let us know below. Springfield has more to show us. It always does. Subscribe if you want to come back. We'll leave the light on. Appendix. The details you will notice now. A field guide to watching Springfield differently. Everything we have covered in this video changes the experience of watching the show. Not in a way that removes the pleasure of it, but in a way that adds layers to the pleasure. The way knowing the structure of a piece of music changes the experience of listening to it without making the listening less enjoyable. Here is what you will notice now. When the show cuts to an overhead shot of Springfield and the nuclear plant dominates the skyline, you will notice it in a way you may not have before. The cooling towers in the background of the establishing shot, the smoke or steam rising from them, the plant situated at the top of the hill above the town, upstream from the river that passes through, at the geographic position from which contamination flows most efficiently into the community below. The show placed the plant where it is with awareness of what that placement means. The plant is not coincidentally dominant in Springfield's landscape. It is the organizing center of the landscape, and every establishing shot that includes it is the show reminding you of what organizes everything you are about to watch. When Homer picks up a glass of water, you will think about where that water comes from. When Marge makes coffee, when the children drink from the tap, when any Springfield resident engages with the town's water supply in any of its daily manifestations, you will think about what has been established about that water supply and what the show has been telling you about the people consuming it. When Burns appears on screen and looks well-maintained and cognitively sharp for a man who by any reckoning should have died decades ago, you will think about the weekly treatment and the glowing walk through the woods and the doctor's report about every disease simultaneously and the specific equation that keeps Burns alive. The treatments balance the diseases, the wealth funds, the treatments. The plant generates the wealth. The contamination maintains the compliance. The compliance allows the plant to keep generating the wealth. Burns glowing in the dark is the visible evidence of the system running at capacity. He is in good health this week. He will be in good health next week. He will be in good health as long as Smithers manages the calendar. When Maggie watches from the high chair with those enormous eyes and says nothing, you will think about what she has been storing, what she has been learning, what the 36 years of deliberate silence and strategic invisibility have been preparation for. You will look at her differently. Not as the baby who is a running gag about an always small youngest sibling, but as the most carefully observed person in Springfield, the one who has been watching everything that the rest of the family and the rest of the town have been too managed or too damaged or too busy to watch. When the episode ends and the reset is complete and Springfield is exactly as it was, you will think about the mechanism. The vote that Springfield cast to maintain the comfortable fiction. The legal decree against acknowledging the truth. The real Seymour Skinner tied to a train and expelled from the community for the crime of being real. The reset is not a cartoon convention. The reset is Springfield's most practiced skill, applied automatically, below the level of conscious choice, the way all skills that have been practiced long enough move below the level of conscious choice. When Homer finds his way home at the end of the episode, whatever route the story required him to take, you will think about the love that navigates him there. The thing the contamination did not reach, and the conspiracy did not manage, and the crayon did not diminish. The thing that persists, quietly, in the background of every catastrophe, drawing Homer back to the couch and the family because the love is more fundamental than the damage, because the damage only affects the mechanisms, and the love is not a mechanism. These are the things the iceberg gives you. Not answers, not certainties, not the resolution of mysteries that the show has spent 36 years carefully not resolving. Just a way of watching that holds more of what the show is offering, that receives the deeper layers alongside the comedy surface, that lets the full weight of what the show built land rather than deflecting it with the comfortable assumption that what you see is all there is. The questions that stay open. Some of the questions we asked throughout this video have answers, or at least answers that the evidence strongly supports. The radiation is real, in the sense that the show's canon provides sufficient evidence to make the case coherently within the show's own internal logic. The Burns conspiracy is real, in the same sense. The collective denial is explicitly depicted in The Principal and The Pauper, and implicitly present in every reset. The prediction phenomenon is real, explained most fully by the combination of volume, confirmation bias, and the specific analytical expertise of a writing staff that includes people who know their fields well enough to project their trajectories accurately. Some questions remain genuinely open. Whether Homer is in a coma, in the sense of whether the coma theory is the intended reading of the show's post, 1993 tonal shift, is not something the available evidence settles. The writers have denied it. The structure of the evidence supports it. Both things are true simultaneously, which is the most interesting state for this particular question to be in. Whether Maggie intentionally shot Burns remains unresolved, in the specific sense that the show provided an official answer that is internally inconsistent and then provided a later canonical moment, Homer's Season 18 confession, that destabilizes the official answer without replacing it with a confirmed alternative. The answer the show gave and the answer the evidence supports may not be the same answer. The show has been living with this ambiguity for 30 years without resolving it. What Maggie is waiting for is the most genuinely open question in Springfield. The show has provided the tools to understand that she is waiting for something and that what she is waiting for will be significant when it arrives. It has not told us what it is. It may never tell us. Springfield may end without Maggie speaking the thing she knows, without the action she has been preparing for being depicted, without the show committing to the full weight of what it has built into this character across 36 years of deliberate silence. If the show ends without Maggie speaking, without the thing she has been building being shown, this will be the show's final and most complete act of collective denial, the quiet burial of its own deepest question, under the accumulated weight of all the episodes that preceded it, the comfortable maintenance of the eternal present at the cost of the most significant story it has been holding in reserve. Or, the show will end with Maggie speaking, and whatever she says will be the ending of a story that began in 1989 and has been running since then, every episode, below the comedy surface, in the specific language of the things the show shows you and trusts you to understand without explaining. Either ending would be, in its own way, true to Springfield. Springfield keeps its secrets. Springfield makes honesty illegal and exiles the messengers who carry it and maintains its comfortable fiction at the cost of whatever the fiction requires paying. But Maggie knows. Maggie has always known. And at the bottom of the iceberg, in the deepest water, that is enough. The fish has 3 eyes. The plant is leaking. Burns is alive. Homer is in Sector 7G. Lisa is playing her saxophone alone in her room. Bart is 10 years old and will be 10 years old forever, which means the world he lives in still contains the possibility that someone who hasn't stopped disrupting things will find the right thing to disrupt. And Maggie is watching. She has always been watching. Good night. Closing meditation. The couch, the family, the loop. There is a version of Springfield that exists only in the mind of someone who has been watching the show for a long time. Not the Springfield of any individual episode, not the Springfield of the canonical geography or the specific backstories, but the Springfield that accumulates from watching long enough that the town starts to feel like somewhere you have actually been. This version of Springfield has a specific quality that actual places have, and fictional places rarely achieve. It has depth. Not just width, not just the horizontal expanse of many characters and many locations and many years of accumulated story, but vertical depth, the sense that beneath what is visible there is more that is not visible, that the surface is a surface rather than a floor, that what you are seeing is the top layer of something that extends much further down. The iceberg is the name for that depth. The theories are the attempts to describe what is down there. Neither the name nor the attempts fully captures the experience of being in Springfield long enough to feel the depth beneath the surface. You have to be there, watching, for long enough. You have to let the accumulation happen. You have to stop, occasionally, and notice what has been deposited by all the hours of watching. The specific texture of a place that has been built with enough care and consistency across enough time to achieve something that very few fictional worlds ever achieve. Springfield is real in the way that places that have been loved for long enough become real. Not factually real, not geographically locatable, not capable of existing outside the medium that contains it. But real in the way that the places in the deepest books are real to the people who love those books, as specific and as inhabited and as weighted with meaning as any place in the physical world. The iceberg is the evidence of that realness. 36 years of careful construction, of detail layered on detail, of pattern established and developed and complicated and extended, until the world built from those details is deep enough and specific enough to support the kind of sustained attention that looks for what is not shown alongside what is shown, that finds in the negative space between canonical events a second story running parallel to the first. The second story is the one we follow down the iceberg, the family damaged by specific forces, the love that persists through the damage, the conspiracy that organized the damage, the dream that refuses to acknowledge the damage, the denial that makes the damage invisible to the people living inside it, the prediction machine that has been describing the damage and the world that produced it for 36 years without the world fully recognizing itself in the description. All of it is the show. All of it was always the show. The comedy surface and the dark infrastructure beneath it were built together by the same people, for the same audience, serving the same ultimate purpose: to depict, as fully and as honestly as the comedy format allows, what it looks like to be a family inside systems that do not serve families, and to show that love persists there anyway, not because love is invincible, but because the specific love in this specific family is stronger than what has been done to it. That is The Simpsons. That is the iceberg. That is Springfield. We'll leave you there. Good night. Thank you. Drop a comment below with where you watch this from and what time it is. Subscribe for more. And take care of yourselves out there in whatever Springfield you live in. The couch is always here if you need it. One last thing. The show within the show. There is a version of The Simpsons that nobody has watched. Not because it doesn't exist, because it can't be watched as a single thing. It can only be assembled, slowly, over years of watching, from the pieces the show leaves lying around in its own structure. The callbacks and the contradictions and the buried backstories and the details that don't quite fit the comedy surface they are embedded in. This version is not the comedy version or the political version or the emotional version or the horror version, though it contains elements of all of them. It is the version that is the full sum of all the versions, the one you arrive at when you have watched long enough and closely enough and with enough willingness to follow the threads wherever they lead. Even when they lead somewhere the show did not explicitly invite you to go. This version is the one the iceberg describes. And now you have it. Or the beginning of it. The full version takes longer to accumulate than any single video can provide. It accumulates over years, over rewatches, over the specific experience of returning to a show you have watched before and finding that it has more in it now than it had the last time, because you have more in you now than you had the last time. Springfield grows with you. Not because it changes, it does not change. It cannot change. The floating timeline prevents change. It grows with you because you change, and the things in you that have changed are the instruments through which you receive what the show is sending. And as those instruments develop and deepen, they receive more of what was always there to be received. The fish has 3 eyes. The plant is leaking. Burns is alive, on his weekly schedule, maintained by Smithers's logistical devotion, sustained by the same substance he has been putting into Springfield's water for as long as anyone can remember. Homer is in Sector 7G, failing to notice another meltdown warning, dreaming or not dreaming, broken or not broken, finding his way home at the end of the shift to the couch and the family and the love that persists through everything. Lisa is playing her saxophone. Bart is 10 years old. Maggie is watching. Good night, Springfield. We'll see you next time. Subscribe. Come back. The iceberg goes deeper than one video can follow. Afterward, on the nature of the iceberg. An iceberg is not a metaphor about hidden danger. That is how the word is usually used, but the iceberg itself is not about danger. An iceberg is about mass, about the relationship between what is visible and what is not, between the part that is above the water and the part that is below it, the ratio of surface to depth that makes an iceberg what it is, a floating structure whose visible portion is a small fraction of its total extent. The Simpsons Iceberg is like this. The visible portion is the comedy, the characters, the satire, the entertainment value that has kept the show on the air for 36 years and has made it the most watched animated series in the history of American television. This is the part above the water. It is significant. It is the reason the show exists and the reason people watch it and the reason it has persisted long past the point where any reasonable production logic would have called for its conclusion. The part below the water is everything we followed down through this video. The radiation and the conspiracy and the dream and the denial and the locked timeline and the buried backstories and the unresolved mysteries and the carefully constructed second text that runs beneath the comedy surface and has been running there since the first season. This part is larger than the visible portion. It is always larger. The ratio is the same as the ratio in an actual iceberg, and the ratio is what makes the structure interesting, what makes the depth worth following, what makes the experience of watching the show differently after going down the iceberg different from the experience of watching it without having gone down. You cannot unsee what the iceberg contains once you have seen it. The yellow skin is information now. The four fingers are information now. The three-eyed fish is the thesis. Burns is the system made visible. Homer is the system's most complete product and most profound failure simultaneously. The man the system broke and the man the system could not break, the person whose compliance it purchased and whose love it could not reach. And Maggie is watching, still watching, always watching. The thing below the water, the part the iceberg keeps below the surface. The question the show has been holding in reserve for 36 years, patient as the ice, cold as the deep water, preserved by the same mechanisms of Springfield's denial that have preserved everything else, Springfield decided not to acknowledge. Maggie knows. And someday, in the show that never ends, in the loop that runs as long as we run it, in the eternal present of a town that made time illegal along with everything else that threatens the comfortable arrangement, she will speak. And Springfield, with all its mechanisms of denial and all its legal infrastructure against inconvenient truths, will hear it. For the first time, and it will be the thing it has always needed to hear. Good night.